For the first time since the death of her parents, Emily could say she was happy. Being the bride of a successful businessman turned out to be a very good thing, but since she was a wealthy heiress, it wasn't about the money. Emily simply loved Kevin and dreamed of marrying him. There were no barriers to marriage. Emily's father, Alexander Brown, died in a plane crash 2 years ago, and terminally ill mother, Irina Brown, and even earlier. It so happened that she had no other relatives left. Therefore, the girl often thought about how great it would be to meet a good man and create a family with him. Only that's where to find him. Emily was a slender, attractive blonde with a gentle blush, with huge blue eyes and incredibly attractive, plump lips, reminiscent of ripe strawberries. It seemed easy to find a groom with such beauty. But Emily wanted to love her, not the company and the 2-story house she got from her parents. Unfortunately, these guys literally attacked the rich heiress, and she completely lost faith in men. And now, finally, Emily smiled luck in the form of a handsome and generally pleasant guy. That afternoon, she stopped in for a bite to eat at her favorite cafe, and ordering a coffee and a piece of red velvet cake, took a seat by the window as usual. "You're not busy," heard Emily in a beautiful baritone. The girl slowly looked up and saw a tall brunette of athletic build. "The cafe is half empty," Emily shrugged. "Yeah, sure," the stranger nodded and smiled disarmingly. "It's just that this is my favorite place. I apologize if I bothered you." "Go ahead and sit down," Emily replied, obeying a sudden impulse, and smiled involuntarily. "May I rejoice the boy?" "You can," Emily confirmed with a smile, and the brunette headed for the counter. "Ice cream for the prettiest girl," he announced when he returned. "By the way, my name is Kevin. What's yours?" "And I'm Emily." That's a beautiful name. And the owner of it is beautiful under the delicious ice cream, sprinkled with creamy caramel syrup. The young people talked and immediately felt a mutual sympathy. In half an hour, Emily felt as if she and Kevin had known each other for years. How else to explain that the new acquaintance seemed to guess all her thoughts and understood from half a word? And then there was more. It turned out that they liked the same movies and books. "Have I found my soulmate?" thought Emily. That's the kind of guy we could do something with. The girl was suddenly ashamed of her thoughts. Kevin was in his mid-20s or early 30s, dressed in brand-name clothes. And when he first approached, Emily had time to look at the keys to the Lexus. If he wasn't married, he must have a girlfriend.
It's the kind of guy they pick up, young Emily thought.
Kevin was staring at her, and from the look on his face, he clearly wanted to say something, but he was trying to gather his wits. "Yeah," she smiled. "I wouldn't be intrusive if I asked you out to, say, a movie." "Why not?" And yes, after the movie there was a restaurant and a walk through the night city, and so began their romance. And soon Emily realized that she would like to connect her life with this very man. But would Kevin want that? "You know what, babe? I dreamed about church today, and you're all in white, so beautiful. It's breathtaking," he once said. "Kevin, I think you and I could have a beautiful family." "Is that a suggestion?" asked Emily, a little embarrassed. "Well, let's just say it's foreplay," Kevin smiled. "For now, I have some things to take care of, and you and I will celebrate our engagement." Things were looking up for the wedding. In 2 months, the young people had never once quarreled. Day by day, Emily became more and more convinced that their taste coincided in everything. Everything they touched was idyllic. There was only one problem with Kevin and Emily's relationship. And was it a problem? Kevin was already married, and Emily found out about it by accident. After seeing her fiancé off one day, she noticed a passport on the hallway floor. Probably dropped from the bag, decided the girl, and purely machine looked into the document. And when Emily, having opened the 14th page, saw the stamp, she felt sick. What does that mean? Kevin is married, she thought in amazement. Then why all this talk about getting married? Emily spent the rest of the evening in a state of prostration, desperately thinking, why is she so unlucky? For once she'd met a decent, well-off young man, and he was married. That's why Kevin had talked about getting married, but hadn't done anything about it. After some thought, Emily decided not to jump to conclusions. The morning would be wiser in the evening. "Well, since we're getting married, you have a right to know everything about me," Kevin said, and she breathed a sigh of relief. I really was married. There was renewed doubt in the girl's soul. After all, there was no dissolution of marriage stamp. But in the case of the death of one of the spouses, it is not put there. "Your wife is dead." "I'm sorry, I didn't know." A thing of the past, Kevin nodded. "Lisa drowned. It happened a year ago. Drank a lot. I did everything I could. Went to rehab and held on. 0 results. She would hold on for a month at the most. Then she'd break down, and there was no stopping her. And one day she went in the water drunk as a skunk." Emily didn't know what to say. Condolence? It was a year ago. And if they'd met, Kevin had found the strength to move on and was trying to be happy again. Should she say she's sorry? Was she? Emily was not familiar with her lover's ex-wife, so she could not truly regret her passing. It was a pity, of course, that a young woman had gone, but that was all. Anyway, Emily's heart was relieved. She was well aware that things happened in life. She decided not to dwell on it. The important thing was that Kevin hadn't lied to her. Though there was talk of marriage, it was becoming less and less frequent. Emily decided not to rush things. Then, one day, she received a letter. After her father's death, Emily became the owner of a solid food company. Despite the entreaties of those who wanted to get cheaply promoted firm, Emily did not agree to sell. Brown's heiress, not without the help of his deputy and lawyer, quite quickly got into the affairs of the firm and began to manage, to the great annoyance of the skeptics who claimed that the girl would ruin the firm. Emily turned out to be an excellent manager, and no wonder. Not only did she inherit her father's business acumen, but she also had a degree in economics, and not just anywhere, but in Germany. The firm hasn't lost a single partner. In fact, it gained new ones, and that was entirely Emily's fault, so the letters were not new to her. Probably another commercial offer the young businesswoman thought with satisfaction, but this was not it. Lisa Smith, Emily muttered aloud. Lisa Smith, the last name and first name seemed vaguely familiar to her. And then it hit Emily. Kevin's last name was Smith, his wife's name was Lisa, yeah, but she was dead. Then how could that be? Coincidence? From the outside, it looked like an unintelligent prank. Come on, who needs it? Emily retorted. At the same time, the question came up, should she tell her fiancé about the mysterious message? After a moment's thought, she decided to refrain for the time being. He might get upset. But she didn't want to keep silent either. Deciding that it would be a good idea to get to the bottom of this, Emily set to work, but she couldn't think of anything else to do. Allegedly, her late wife had addressed her with a single phrase, "Watch out, not another word." It wasn't clear who or what she was supposed to be watching out for. Emily looked at her watch. There were 2.5 hours left until the end of the workday. No meetings with vendors or partners were scheduled, so she might as well leave. I'm leaving, she told the secretary and left the office. Goodbye, Emily Alexandrovna. Goodbye, she nodded absent-mindedly. Emily got into her trusty Infinity and wondered where to begin her investigation. The heiress of the grocery company suddenly imagined herself the protagonist of a detective series, and it must be said, she liked the feeling. And if I do not change my occupation, she jokingly thought to herself. The positive attitude made Emily think she should start with the cemetery. She had no idea what she'd find there, but something told her it wouldn't be a wasted trip, and so it was. Emily knew where her predecessor was buried. She'd taken Kevin there a week ago. I want to order a monument for her, and I need to figure out the dimensions. The groom explained the purpose of his visit to the cemetery. Once there, Emily walked briskly to Lisa's grave. Nothing horrible was found there. None of the vandalism she had secretly feared had occurred. The grave looked exactly as it had last time. But what then? Emily wondered. And then she answered her own question. It looked like someone had been playing a stupid prank, and she fell for it. She was playing detective. Emily heard the laughter. No, it's not a prank, she said. Turning around, Emily saw a young man of short stature. A gravedigger, she guessed, and asked in surprise, "How do you know me?" "I know the cemetery attendant," replied evasively. "That is, not exactly. It's just that I've been told you might come." "And that's who told you?" Emily was completely confused. "You know what? Let's go to my place," the man suggested and muttered. "There's not many ears that can hear us." She was suddenly afraid. God, what have I gotten myself into, she thought with horror. Lisa Smith's grave is empty, the gravedigger began without preface. She's not there. She's alive. Alive? He nodded and told Emily a macabre story. A year ago, Tom, that was the name of the employee of this mournful place, heard a heart-rending scream, and looking around the cemetery, he found no one and thought, "Am I hallucinating?" Tom went to his gatehouse, but the scream came again. Then he realized the sound was coming from underground. "It makes my hair stand on end," the gravedigger shuddered. Tom dug up the grave. Luckily, the woman was alive. He picked the poor thing up in his arms, and just in time, Lisa fainted. About an hour later, she came to herself, Tom recalled, and then she told him that she had been buried alive. Who whispered Emily, praying to God that her terrible guess was wrong. But alas, the husband, the gravedigger, replied. Lisa begged Tom to shelter her. It's a frightful man, she whispered. I am afraid. Hide me, I beg you. And where is she now? Emily inquired. I brought Lisa to my place that day. And then we fell in love, married. We're expecting a baby. And everything would be fine. But Lisa is afraid of her ex-husband. We did some research and found out that Kevin Smith has a reputation as a black widower. He eliminates brides and then embezzles their assets. More like Bluebeard, Emily said in a shaky voice. It wasn't until a moment later that she realized she was shivering a fine tremor. Yes, I am, Tom nodded. But hasn't anyone reported him? The stunned girl asked. No, the gravedigger shook his head. They're afraid. That Smith fellow has powerful patrons. That's why Lisa has been hiding from him for a year. And recently she happened to see you two together in town and decided to warn you. But how did she get my address? Emily felt like she was having a bad dream. In the age of social media, it's not that hard, Tom hummed. That Smith guy's profile is closed, but luckily he never deleted Lisa from his friends. Apparently he wants to show he honors his late spouse's memory. Lisa turned on stealth mode. She used it to find you, and then it was a matter of technique. So the letter came to the email. The businessman's heiress frowned. She didn't want to believe her fiancé had turned out to be such a scumbag. You know, Emily, the gravedigger smiled, looking out the window. You're about to hear it all firsthand. The appearance of the young pregnant woman in the gatehouse dashed all her hopes that she was dreaming, albeit a creepy dream nonetheless. So your page has an email address on it, Lisa explained with a smile. I signed with my first name, and the expectation that you know them. The hope, of course, is 50-50. But what the hell is not to joke about? At any rate, I knew the name of the unfortunate one Kevin had before me. Emily remembered that not too long ago she'd converted her profile into a business account and posted an email address for potential clients. Well, that had served her well. However, something was bugging Emily. But how come you were buried alive, she wondered. To be honest, young Mrs. Brown didn't much believe the gravedigger and his wife. Had the young, healthy woman failed to defend herself? And who knows what the two men were up to? He drugged me with some kind of drugs. Then he took me to the river and threw me down, Lisa said. I was swept ashore by the current. Yes, there was no autopsy, the young woman confirmed. Kevin enlisted his powerful patrons to ensure that there was no autopsy. Lisa was buried promptly. But apparently she was born under a lucky star. Already in the grave, the young woman came to her senses. Terrible, exclaimed Emily. She was now absolutely certain that Lisa Smith's grave was indeed empty. What to do with the groom now? Turn him in to the police. Where was the evidence against him? You should have gone to the police in the first place, she sighed. You can't prove anything now. I wouldn't be so sure of that, Lisa objected. You can prove anything if you want to. I have an idea. What kind of idea? Emily wondered, feeling the thrill of the hunt. Put up a hidden camera and watch Kevin. What will he do next? I think there's going to be a puncture sooner or later. The grocery company owner thought about it and decided Lisa's idea would most likely work well. I'll do it. They agreed to keep in touch, and Emily rolled into town. At first there was nothing on the tape, and young Mrs. Brown even felt something like disappointment. It had been a busy day. Emily was disastrously busy, and when the day was over, she had a quick call with Lisa when she got home. She collapsed into bed and fell asleep instantly. The next day, when she had a spare moment at work, Emily decided to watch the tape. When she saw Kevin on the screen, she held her breath and suddenly noticed that her fiancé had slipped something into the carafe in which Emily poured homemade lemonade. Rewinding to last night's tape, she found Kevin doing the same thing and nearly sobbed. How could I have been so thoughtless? Emily scolded herself. I could really go to the other side of the world like that. When she returned from work, she immediately poured out the contents of the decanter and rinsed it thoroughly. Emily suddenly remembered yesterday's lethargy. She was already exhausted at work, and then she had refreshed herself with her favorite drink. So it was no wonder Emily hadn't even had the energy to wash herself. She assumed that Kevin was giving her sleeping pills, and from that day on she tried to replace the contents of the carafe. Emily was careful not to let Kevin put sleeping pills in her drinks, but one day she miscalculated. Emily had no idea that Kevin had noticed her pouring the sleeping pills out of the carafe. The girl passed out. Well, it's about time, Kevin thought, and proceeded with another body removal operation. He decided to wrap the bride in a rug, take her to the woods, and bury her. Kevin remembered that both rugs were in the closet. The woods were half an hour away. The serial killer thought it would be a good idea to have a snack, so he went to the kitchen. He was appetizingly devouring scrambled eggs when suddenly his fiancé's cell phone rang. This is the last thing I need, Kevin thought with annoyance. and decided to answer it. He was going to say that Emily had gone for a walk and forgot her cell phone, but there was silence. It had to be said that Kevin had already changed his mind about getting married. There was no need to, because he had already taken possession of everything that belonged to the bride. The lawyer had never let him down. Hearing her ex-husband's voice, Lisa became alarmed. They had called Emily every day in the morning, but the time was approaching nightfall, and there was no word from the girl. It looks like Emily had a drink with sleeping pills in it, Lisa shared her concern with Tom. Looks that way, her husband agreed. Well, we should call the police. The cops arrived just in time as Adamson, panting, was pulling a heavy rug out of the pantry. The pantry was a small outbuilding adjacent to the mansion, so it was impossible to get into the house undetected. Adamson Kevin, a burly big man with a bushy mustache, asked. The criminal was confused, but managed to pull himself together. Yes, that's me, Kevin confirmed. To what do I owe the honor? Shall we go inside? Sure. Go in quietly, he said to himself. You're not doing anything objectionable, are you? The police officers entered the house and immediately found an emotionless woman. What's the matter with her? Asked another policeman, a short, thin man. So she's dead, Adamson muttered confusedly, realizing the situation was getting out of hand. How did they get here? He puzzled. The mustachioed big man walked over to Emily, felt for her pulse, and immediately refuted Kevin's words. Alive, but unconscious, he said. Adamson's calling an ambulance. She's alive, Adamson said, and they're going to save her. They will? Really? The second officer nodded, much to your regret. Why, unfortunately? You know best, he grinned, squinted his eyes, and asked, if you thought the woman was dead, why didn't you tell us and call an ambulance? Well, I was about to, Kevin mumbled. Really? Why did you bring the rug? Well, I was just, I wanted to make a bed. Can't you do that in the summer? The mustachioed man snorted incredulously. Why did the woman have to die? And by the way, who is she to you? Listen, you, Adamson exclaimed, gathering his courage. I'll only answer in the presence of an attorney. Well, that's your right. Come with us. You'll have a lawyer. A third policeman entered the house. The witnesses have arrived, he reported. Kevin concluded that he was in charge. The policeman found a camera in the house and examined the videotapes without leaving the cash register. Well, it's all very clear, concluded the officer of the law. Kevin Adamson was given 25 years in a maximum security penal colony. It turned out that there were several other deaths and other scams on him. Some people are less lucky than you and me, Lisa said, as the women left the courthouse. That's true, Emily sighed. It would seem that justice had been served, and she should be happy. But why did she feel a twinge of pain in her heart? Emily's mood was not hidden from Lisa's eyes. What's wrong with you? She asked. No, nothing. In fact, at this moment the girl was experiencing incredible disappointment. The man she loved turned out to be a murderer. Moreover, Kevin wanted to kill her, as he had done to 6 women. Not counting Lisa, her mind understood it all, but her heart refused to understand or accept it. Emily, I have a suggestion, Lisa said. Maybe we can go to some cafe? Celebrate, if you do not mind. I'd like that. No, guys, Emily refused. I've got a lot of work to do, and I need to get it done today. So some other time. Well, some other time. Emily didn't really have any urgency. She just wanted to be alone. A month passed. The soul wound was slowly but surely healing, and who knows? Maybe it would have been gone by now if it hadn't been for an accident after another hard day's work. Emily was on her way home from work and stopped by the supermarket. After filling her shopping cart to the brim, she went to the checkout. Auntie, could you lend me some money? Emily heard a pitiful voice. In front of her stood a skinny boy about 6 or 7 years old. Where are your parents? She asked. I only have my dad. He's sick. He used to work as a longshoreman, but now he can't. He has a cold in his lungs. And I'm hungry. I haven't eaten anything since this morning. You poor thing, she exclaimed. Come on, I'll buy you some food. What do you like? Pasta, the child replied, and buns and sausages. I see. Emily nodded with a smile. Besides pasta, buns, and sausages, she bought bread, vegetables, fruit, herbs, cheese, yogurt, juice, and deli meats. Wow, that's a lot of stuff, exclaimed the boy. Thank you very much. You're welcome, smiled Emily. Let's go to the drugstore. Let's get your dad some medicine. What's your name, by the way? Michael, the child said shyly. That's a beautiful name. They loaded the groceries into the trunk. Emily told the boy, Get in, I'll take you for a spin. Michael hesitated a little. but still sat down. "Where do you live?" Emily asked. "It's not far." When Emily entered the apartment where Michael lived with his father, she almost lost her senses. The boy's dad looked exactly like Kevin. This can't be true, Emily thought, and suddenly she thought with horror. Could he have escaped from prison? When the man saw his son in the company of a beautiful, expensively dressed young woman, he was surprised. "Dad, this is Aunt Emily," Michael said cheerfully. "She is very good. Look how much she bought, and she bought medicine for you, too." I could see by the look in his eyes that he was terribly embarrassed. Still, he had to accept the help so that the child would not starve. When Emily was sure it wasn't Kevin, she felt better. "Thank you," the man said embarrassedly and coughed. "Unfortunately, I won't be able to pay you back anytime soon, but I'll pay you back when I get back to work." "Oh, please," Emily waved her hand. "It's a child, after all." "Well, no, I can't do that." Okay, she hastened to agree. "We'll talk about it later." "Okay?" The man, whose name was John, nodded and suddenly remarked, "You're looking at me kind of weird." "It's just that you remind me of someone," Emily said. "So I was wondering if you two might be related." "Impossible," John spread his hands. "I grew up alone in an orphanage." "Well, I see." Emily nodded, suddenly feeling like she was falling off her feet. "Okay, guys, I've got to go. It was nice meeting you." "Likewise," John replied and asked, "How do I find you guys? To get my money back." What a sensitive guy, Emily thought, and handed him her business card and walked out of the apartment. On the way home, she thought about how many coincidences there were in life after all. Emily was sure that John was probably related to the man who had somehow been separated from his family. She suddenly realized she was dying to solve this mystery and decided to keep them in her sights. But that wasn't the only reason. At first, Emily had been afraid to admit it, even to herself. But the truth was obvious. Emily still loved Kevin, so why not turn her attention to a supposed twin brother? After all, consider the same man, as it turned out. The one and not the other. Despite the striking resemblance, John turned out to be the exact opposite of his convicted brother. He kept saying that he would pay Emily back for the groceries, while Kevin wanted to rip her off. She spent the next day thinking of an excuse to show up at their apartment, but she couldn't come up with anything. And when she stopped by the same supermarket after work, she saw Michael there again. "Well, hello there," she said cheerfully. "Hello," smiled the boy. "Are you coming to see us again?" "Why?" she asked, thinking happily. There's an excuse. And so she began to enter their apartment. Emily wondered where John's wife had gone, but she didn't ask. What if she was an alcoholic or worse? A drug addict with no parental rights? She remembered Kevin's story about his wife and grinned wryly. By the way, I should call Lisa. Emily had invited Alexander Richtov, the best doctor in town, to see John, and he'd recommended he go to the hospital. "Is that necessary?" the sick man asked. "You see, I have a son." "At any rate, it is desirable," replied the doctor, and looking at Emily, he asked, "Isn't your spouse going to take care of the baby?" "My spouse?" John stopped talking and nodded. "That's clear. The wife is a businesswoman, no time for a child. Oh, those modern young families." When Emily realized the doctor had mistaken them for husband and wife, she barely contained her laughter. As for John, he blushed to the roots of his hair, though perhaps it was the hot tea he'd just drunk. "You misunderstand," the patient said. "We're not husband and wife. I'm raising my son alone. My wife died in childbirth." Emily shamed herself at the thought of her alcoholic wife and hastened to assure him that she would take care of Michael. "We'll go to my place," she told the boy, "to a big house with a pool." "Really?" Michael asked excitedly, and his eyes sparkled. "Really?" Emily smiled. "Do you really live here?" exclaimed the boy as they pulled up to the mansion. "Yes," just the young woman replied. "And since we're here, I guess we do." "I've only seen houses like this in movies," the child said simply. "Are you hungry?" Emily inquired. "I am," Michael replied like an adult. "Am I going to swim in the pool?" "Lunch first, then swimming." "As much as your heart desires," she smiled. Suddenly, she felt like a mom and decided there was something to that feeling. John spent 10 days in the hospital, and the whole time he couldn't stop thinking about the beautiful blonde woman who had suddenly appeared in his and Michael's lives. Emily was undoubtedly very attractive, but the slender, blue-eyed, and seemingly natural blonde could boast not only looks, but intelligence. She was also kind and helpful. "I think about her too much," John decided. Suddenly, he realized he was in love. The discovery did not make him happy. After all, John couldn't help but realize that he and Emily were people from different worlds, and John hadn't asked what their new acquaintance did for a living. But judging by the expensive clothes, the keys to the infinity, and the ease with which she splurged on groceries and medications, assumed she worked for a reputable company. Clearly not a rich slacker who squandered her parents', husbands, or rich lovers' money. Either way, John was no match for her, and all he had to do was thank Emily for all she'd done for them, return the money, and bow out. Yeah, but then there was Michael, who was clearly in love with her. We'll just have to wait and see, John concluded. And the day she was discharged from the hospital, Emily arrived. How's your health? She asked. And the man sensed that she really cared. Thank you. Much better, well. That's wonderful, the girl replied cheerfully. Get in. Let's go, yeah. I'd take the bus, John mumbled hesitantly. But the young woman stretched out with a laugh. You know my address. Michael's at my place. Let's go. I've ordered a celebratory dinner. Well, sit down already. Well, Michael, let's go home, John asked his son after lunch. No, declared the boy. Well, let's stay here a little longer indeed, John said, the landlady with a smile. Why don't you really stay? You can even spend the night. There's plenty of room for everyone, yes. Yes, Michael clapped his hands together. Eventually, John allowed himself to be talked into it. They enjoyed a swim in the pool and, after conferring, went for a walk. It's beautiful here, John said approvingly, looking out over the field and the small but picturesque lake. Yes, it's a paradise in summer, Emily said proudly. They returned home in the late afternoon. All three of them were hungry, so dinner was finished in a flash. And when Michael, tired from the abundance of impressions, went to bed, the hospitable hostess took out a bottle of old-aged wine from the cellar, cut cheese, fruit, and called John to the terrace. The heat's finally broken, Emily said, settling into an armchair. It sure has nodded her guest. I wonder sometimes. We wait until summer to complain about the heat, later to complain about the heat, she repeated to herself. And the loader doesn't know those words, John. What's your education? If it's no secret, Emily asked. I'm an IT guy by training, an IT guy, she wondered. And work as a longshoreman, that's about it, John said. Work's a little tight these days. Sometimes, though, I fix computers and phones, that's crazy. John, I want to offer you a job. I'd like to find a job. I don't have any, unfortunately. But managers make good money too. Your place is where? He asked, perplexed. Didn't I tell you? I'm the director of the Smack Food Company. Have you heard of it? Well, yes. As a matter of fact, John nodded, remembering how Emily had given him her business card on the first day they met. True, John had slipped it into his pocket and safely forgotten it. Are you willing to give it a try, Emily? He said firmly. I really am eternally grateful to you for everything, but I can't accept handouts. So what handouts? Exclaimed the businesswoman. It just seemed to me that you'd like the manager's position better than the loader's. No, if you don't want it, I won't insist after all. She seems offended, John thought, not without surprise, and said aloud, all right, let's try the manager's job. It turned out to be much more interesting than being a loader, and John was doing a great job. Some, however, looked at him askew, saying that the lady boss had her eye on him and put him on the breadline. Never mind, Emily waved her hand. I'm not paying attention anyway, but what if it's true? She asked quietly. What, that I have my eye on you? The young people never realized who had made the first move. They kissed frantically and seemed unable to get enough of each other. That same evening, John and his son moved into Emily's mansion. Are we family now? Michael asked. And Emily is going to be my mom, well, if she wants to be, replied the father. Of course she wants to, muttered the boy with conviction, and John suddenly said, I'll be right out. Where are you going? Emily wondered. Wherever I need to go, he replied evasively, and ran out of the house. John returned about 20 minutes later with a bouquet of scarlet roses, and returning, he asked in a heartfelt voice, Emily, will you marry me? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Of course I will, yea, shouted Michael. The news of the impending wedding of the company owner and the new manager spread through the office faster than wildfire. That'll make him her deputy. Tom Young, one of the employees who was secretly sighing for his boss, muttered gloomily. Is that all that bothers you? Gloatingly smirked office manager Lisa, who in turn looked at Tom with a laugh. Such were the passions simmering in the office, and the lovers just enjoyed happiness. Together they raised Michael and looked forward to the wedding, which was scheduled in 2 months. If something had overshadowed Emily's happiness, it is that she never decided to tell her lover about Kevin. On the one hand, there was nothing terrible about it. There were few coincidences in life. But on the other hand, she had the feeling that their married life had begun with deception. One day, coming home from work, Emily noticed something white in the mailbox, probably from the IRS, she thought. When she looked at the return address, she felt hot. The letter was from prison, and there was only one person who could have sent it. John wasn't home. He'd gone to pick up Michael from the preschool swim class, so Emily was alone. She sat down on the living room couch and hurriedly printed out the message. "Here's admire what you've done," bitch Kevin wrote. "Do you realize my life is over?" It was as if Emily was forcing him to run scams and kill poor women. Attached to the letter was a photo of the ex-fiancé in a prison robe. Trim bald, with a cocky grin. He looked so repulsive that Emily felt nauseous. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. She barely had time to hide the letter behind the couch cushions. "Is something wrong?" John asked, noticing the look on his fiancée's face. No, she shrugged. "Everything's fine." As the evening wore on, Emily forgot all about the letter. The next day was a day off. They wanted to get a good night's sleep. It had been a long week. Michael, on the other hand, got up early and went to the living room to watch TV. The boy decided to make himself comfortable and put one of the sofa cushions under his head. Underneath it was an envelope. He twirled it in his hands, and then a picture of his daddy fell out of it. It was a picture of him dressed in some gloomy clothes. Michael had seen that in movies about cops and criminals, and for some reason, Daddy had no hair. "You awake, hero?" Dad asked. "Dad, were you bald?" Michael wondered. "I'm bald," marveled John, and his son handed him a photo from the envelope. "Good morning," Emily chimed in. But when she saw John and Michael's faces, she gloomed. "Who's that?" John asked her, sensing he was about to find out something unpleasant. That looks like your twin brother. And you've been hiding the fact that I have a brother all this time," the man exclaimed. "I wanted to say. I really did," Emily mumbled. But for some reason you didn't," John huffed. "Somehow. Yeah, if I told you why. I'm not sure you'd want to hang out with a brother like that. Should I tell you? Or is it better not to?" "Tell me," the groom said reproachfully. "I grew up in an orphanage. I've never had any relatives, not even like this, especially since we're talking about a twin brother. Better none than this one." The young woman never managed to find the words that would fully characterize the scoundrel. "There was a time I loved him. But that's in the past. I love you now, John." But it seemed their relationship was now in question. "One thing I don't understand is why you were nodding," John pondered aloud. "I, as you recall, showed up at your place quite by accident," she reminded him. "Maybe accidentally, maybe not. Either way you knew and kept quiet." "Oh, I just couldn't make up my mind to tell you," Emily muttered in despair and got angry with herself. "Why am I making excuses?" "Dad, Mom, don't fight," Michael muttered pleadingly. "We won't," Dad promised, "because now you and I are going to get out of here." There was so much longing in John's voice that his son didn't argue. This was the second day John had indulged in libations. To think he had a twin brother who was also behind bars. "Daddy, don't drink," Michael pleaded, but his father remained deaf to his pleas. "I'm hungry," the child said with tears in his voice. "You'll find something in the refrigerator," John replied, barely able to speak, and collapsed from the stool to the floor. Michael looked in the refrigerator, but found nothing but frozen hams and a jar of pickles. He cried. When he calmed down a little, he decided to go to Emily's. She would be sure to feed him. Michael remembered that she lived in a village not far from the exit from the city. He had some change, and miraculously, enough for the bus. "Why no adults?" the conductor asked. "They'll meet me," Michael replied, and the woman nodded, "as long as the kid paid the fare." Which he did. The boy got off at the right, as it seemed to him, stop and went in the direction of the mansions. And then he realized that he got off in the wrong place. The houses were mixed with the forest, and soon Michael was horrified to find that he was lost. In addition, there was thunder and heavy rain. He was really scared. He sat down under a tree and wept bitterly. The rain ended as quickly as it had begun. It was dark outside. And Michael wondered in fear if there were wolves in the woods. "Oh my God," he heard an elderly man's voice. "What are you doing here?" "I was on my way to see Emily, and I got lost," Michael exclaimed. "And who would she be?" "Your Emily," inquired the grandfather, who turned out to be a forester. "She's so beautiful," replied the little boy through tears. "She has white hair." "A big car." "Not much," the man summarized. "Is that what you are? Let's go to my place, and I'll try to help you find your Emily." After drinking the flavored tea and homemade buns, Michael was so sleepy he wanted to go to bed. "So lie down," the forester commanded. "Where are your parents?" There was no cell phone on the boy, so there was nothing to think about contacting his father or mother. It would be nice to know for sure who Emily was, but I don't think that's going to happen either. Why would a kid run away from home anyway? I don't have a mom, Michael replied sleepily. Dad and Emily are getting married, and she's going to be my mom. Only they had a fight and Dad got drunk because of it. I see the Forester nodded profoundly. Waking up from the alcoholic oblivion and not finding his son in the apartment, John began to berate himself at the last words. God, what an idiot I am. A bloody alcoholic. This could go all the way to child welfare, Michael, he called out and went to the balcony, hoping with all his heart to find his son there. But alas, the cell phone John had recently bought Michael was lying on the table. It was already dark outside, so it was unlikely that the son was outside. Theoretically, he could have been at one of the neighbors' houses. Emily's realization dawned on John, but of course, now that he'd cooled off, he didn't realize later what had come over him. It wasn't really that big of a deal, really. Emily simply couldn't bring herself to tell him about her brother, and he blamed her for something he didn't understand. Apparently, Emily was in a relationship with Kevin and quite possibly feared jealousy as well. He was an idiot, stirring up a storm. I'll apologize for that, John cheered and dialed Emily's number, just as long as she had Michael. Michael's lost, Emily screamed in a voice that was not her own. How could you, John thought doomfully, scold me? I deserve it. Only what good is self-abuse? How long has he been gone? John asked stiffly. I see, Emily retorted, and with metal in her voice told John to wait for her. God, you stink, she said in disgust. How are you going to work tomorrow? John smiled involuntarily. Emily was talking to him like a stern wife. He liked it an awful lot, just so long as she forgives me. But first, Michael, he thought. What's the cabin? John asked. A woodsman, I guess Emily suggested with a shrug and held out a fruit gum to him. Here, chew on your booze. They say peppermint only makes it worse. The fruity one's just fine. Thanks, John said quietly. You drunkard, the young woman shook her head reproachfully and couldn't help but smile. John realized he was forgiven and sighed in relief. When the young men entered the woodsman's cabin, Michael was sleeping peacefully on a comfortable bed. Why didn't you watch the baby? The ranger shamed them. There's a lot of idiots out there these days. It just happened, John replied. Wife John mumbled, and grandfather took a closer look at him and almost lost his mind. It can't be, he blurted out. What is it? John asked. It's just that you look just like my father when he was young. You look just like him. No, not that, he sighed. Emily agreed with him. They'd had enough of these coincidences. It's just that I recently found my twin brother under not very good circumstances. Lesnikov suddenly turned pale. Oh, God, exclaimed the elderly man, and the lovers literally felt with their skin that another secret was about to be revealed. But this time everything must be all right. The twin brother, you say? Guys, how about some tea? We haven't had any of that incredibly delicious currant drink. And the Forester, whose name was Gregory Peterson, recalled many years ago his wife gave their children to an orphanage. It was a cruel thing to do. But it wasn't that simple, he said. Mary was not well. Then Gregory went hunting and was attacked by a bear. He got a good beating from the bear. And the man thought he wasn't going to make it, but he did. Gregory Peterson was rescued by a gamekeeper. It took him 3 months to get home from a remote part of the forest. Meanwhile, his wife, convinced Gregory was dead, became depressed. One day she got on a bus and took the boys to an orphanage. But she didn't say which one, the Forester said with a sigh. You weren't looking for us, John asked. Well, if it was us, of course. I'm pretty sure it's you, Gregory Peterson said with conviction. And looking for you, of course. But Mary couldn't even explain which orphanage she'd put you in. There were several in the vicinity, in different communities, and you were nowhere to be found. I thought you were adopted. Besides, some orphanages were closed, and the kids were taken to other cities. After all, I was gone for 3 months. What happened to your wife? Emily asked. Mary was diagnosed with a severe mental disorder, and soon she was gone. The story told by the Forester could not be called positive, but John suddenly felt warm. Michael had turned up. Wasn't that a reason to rejoice? Plus, he'd found his brother and his father. And even the fact that his mother had abandoned him and Kevin like unwanted kittens didn't dampen his happiness. All three of them were silent, each thinking about something else. Dad, Emily, are you two not fighting anymore? Michael's voice broke the silence. No, my golden one, the young woman replied fondly, and everyone laughed with relief. The probability of kinship is 100%, solemnly announced the employee of the laboratory. Or did they think so? Thank you, John thanked her with a smile. Now he had a father, and Michael had a grandfather. And it was a grandfather who had saved his grandson from spending the night in the woods. It was only Providence that had led them to each other. And John had a brother, Kevin, and, no matter how Emily looked at him, he was determined to keep in touch with him. Blood isn't water. What if he didn't want to? The bride asked. What if guys like Kevin are not interested in anything but money? We'll see, John said philosophically, and Emily realized that he was determined. But she didn't have time to worry about her ex-fiancé. First of all, today was the last fitting of the wedding dress, with which she helped her future witness Lisa. And secondly, she had a visit to the gynecologist. Yesterday, the happy bride took a pregnancy test, which showed 2 stripes. All that remained was to find out when Emily's new life was born. Johnny, are you busy? Emily asked. The young woman had just left the doctor's office, and she was eager to tell her fiancé the good news. I'm always free for you, John assured her, but as a disciplined subordinate, I'll add that I'm a little busy. Well, that's commendable, Emily said cheerfully. What would you say as a 2-time father-to-be? I say I'm the happiest man in the world, he shouted. The baby was a miracle. As blonde and blue-eyed as her mother, she looks like a little princess, Michael remarked. He cared for his little sister in such a touching way that Emily was moved to tears. Today his son had made a cookie cake. Mary turned 1-year-old today. She's going to be a pastry chef, Grandpa Gregory, who was a frequent visitor to their home, once said. Not the worst profession. By the way, the daughter-in-law replied. We'll plug into the family business. Who's arguing? Michael scurried busily around the house. Helping Mom set the table, soon John arrived, laden with packages from the specialty baby store. His husband entered the house with a huge pink-colored plush elephant and a bunch of balloons with painted dolls on them. The largest of them bore a glittery inscription, Happy Birthday. Princess, the little girl, looked at all this splendor with delight, and the hearts of her parents, grandfather and brother, swooned with love and tenderness for the youngest member of the family. James walked slowly up the white, worn steps. The bank of the rocky river running through the city was high. He had to climb several flights of stairs to reach the embankment. James was shivering in his old down jacket. It was a real gray November. A piercing wind and icy grains were falling from the sky. Here by the river, the temperature was much lower than in the city. It felt like winter was approaching. James pulled his knitted hat over his ears. There was no way he was going to get sick. If he went to bed, he wouldn't be able to pay for a bed at the hostel. There'd be nothing to buy groceries with, let alone medicine, because the life of a homeless man is like a flood. What can you do? James has seen worse times. He slept on a heating duct and lived in a dumpster, surviving as best he could, but he managed to make it through, more or less get on with his life. Until the fulfillment of the main dream to buy his own home, of course, still far away, but already much better than it was. James grew up in a small village with a speaking name, Oaks. Surrounding this place were groves of oaks, especially picturesque in the fall. Little James, as a preschooler, tried to draw them, these beautiful trees. And then, as he grew older, he tried to put what he saw on paper. But it just didn't work. I guess I didn't have enough talent. Childhood is the happiest and coziest time of James' life. The grown man often remembered his early years with nostalgia. And it's not even that. At that time he had a roof over his head, his own bed with clean linen, a guaranteed bowl of soup every day. It's that he was loved then. He wasn't alone. His grandmother, sweet, kind Grandma Patricia, wise, forgiving, warm. It had seemed to James for a long time that she was omnipotent. It was Grandma who always found the right words to dispel her grandson's sadness and anxiety. She was the one who understood what to do in any given situation. She was respected by her neighbors. She seemed to know everything in the world. Also, Grandma was never tired. At least, James couldn't remember her sleeping. When he went to bed, Grandma was still tending to the chores, and when James woke up, she was up and about. Smart, smiling. Grandma was a sturdy woman. Tall, statuesque, energetic. She could not sit idle, always found something to do, worked, maintained the household, and raised her grandson. Yes, a grandmother. This woman did not look like a gray-haired old woman in a sharp scarf. No, James's grandmother was still young, just as he remembered her. Energetic, active, businesslike. Later, James missed her gaze, her warm embrace, her gentle, soothing voice. He sobbed at the impossibility of changing everything. Blaming himself, screaming helplessly into the void. Hopelessness. That's how James would characterize his state of mind. It was not terrible to lose the house. The guy at that time, this moment, was almost not interested. The main thing is that his grandmother was no longer there. James had no other relatives. It happened that way. In villages where almost everyone was a brother-in-law, nephew, or distant relative, it was strange. But what could be done? Grandmother Patricia had come to Oaks as a young girl after her husband, whose name was also James. Grandson was named after his grandfather. He was a good man, kind, hard-working, and skillful. And at work, at the sawmill, he was appreciated and neighbors respected. And James S.R. grew up in an orphanage. He didn't know his family, that's why, probably, he dreamed of creating a strong, big family. Once he went to work in a village almost 100 kilometers away. It's the Pines. It's a remote area. He met a beautiful, modest girl named Patricia. And so it was that they ended up getting married. James and Patricia moved to the Oaks. They became a family at James' house. James worked at his sawmill. Patricia got a job on the farm as a milkmaid. Everything was fine. Everything was fine. All right. They lived soul to soul. Both spouses dreamed of a large family and at least 5 children. But it didn't happen. The couple had a daughter, Hannah. The young parents were not going to stop at this achievement. But the years went by, and Hannah remained the only child in the family. The girl grew up beautiful, not like her mother or father. They were simple country folk, but this was white bone. Fine features, fragile figure, huge violet eyes and golden curls. A princess, indeed. The locals joked about whether Patricia had fattened up such a beauty somewhere in the city. But James had no doubts about his wife's fidelity. The man didn't know his own family and rightly assumed that his daughter had taken after one of his relatives. This was most likely the case. The girl's character matched her appearance. She was smart, capricious, self-loving. And when Hannah grew a little older and realized that she had an attractive appearance, she became proud. Hannah had simple and hardworking parents. Their family lived no worse or better than anyone else. But Hannah was sure that she deserved more. She dreamed of living in a big city and blamed her parents for not bothering to move there in their time. She demanded toys from her mother and father, then outfits and jewelry. She refused to do housework, arguing that she was not going to stay in the countryside for long, and that she needed to study, not sweep floors. Except Hannah wasn't studying. Or rather, she did study, but not at all what they teach in school. She bought magazines and tried to make herself look like one of those models that flashed on the pages of glossy editions. She did makeup, washed and painted a new face again, achieving the perfect result. I learned how to combine closet items correctly, to make different hairstyles out of my golden hair. And it all started when Hannah was about 12. Maybe even a little earlier. I'll go to the city, become a photo model, she said. Maybe even go abroad. But I'm not going to live in a shithole like you, Hannah said. Patricia and James looked at each other in confusion. They both blamed themselves for their daughter's behavior. But what had they done wrong? Patricia herself had grown up in absolute poverty, and even starved. That's why, probably, she tried to please her only daughter, and even a beautiful one at that. James, that in general did not know parental love and was brought up in an orphanage. What can I say? The man, spoiled, of course, long awaited his child. And yet both spouses tried to instill in Hannah basic moral principles. By their example, they showed that it is necessary to work. It is necessary to work. It is necessary to treat others with respect. Patricia taught her daughter to bake pies, to clean the house. Except that the girl from childhood rejected parental attitudes and with all her appearance showed that she dreams of a completely different life. And when she became a teenager, then James and Patricia, that only about themselves, did not listen. And they're losers and they don't think things through. You have no right to tell me what to do. Shouted at her mother and father when they tried to talk some sense into their princess and force her to learn to help them with their chores. You don't. You've done nothing for yourselves. One works at a sawmill for a penny. The other is a dung shoveler in a barn. And there you go. I'm not like you. I want to live differently, and I will. I'll marry a rich man. Or become a model. Who'd marry you, you inept girl? Her father tried to talk some sense into Hannah. You can't cook or clean. Your mother still takes care of you. Don't worry about that. I'm not marrying a village idiot. I'm marrying a rich man. They have servants for all that, answered Hannah. Her parents could not change her mind. She became more and more capricious and more angry. She didn't want to study. She didn't help at home. All she had to do was to look at fashion magazines and spend time on the street with her friends. By the way, Hannah had plenty of admirers on the street. But how could such a beautiful girl? And it was not only boys' classmates, but also grown-up guys. That's what scared Patricia the most. They had conversations with her daughter. She just laughed in their faces. James tried to be tough, locking his wayward daughter up at home to keep her out of trouble. But Hannah always escaped, either through the window, or she got a moment when her mother and father were distracted and ran out the door. She wanted company, wanted to see admiring glances, to hear compliments. All this fueled her faith in herself, her confidence in her own irresistibility, even more convinced that she was worthy of some mythical, better life. And in another life, Beauty dreamed of getting to the other life easy way. Studying at school and then at university, she was not interested. The girl believed that it is too long and difficult. This is for those who were unlucky enough to be born a beauty with huge violet eyes and golden curls, she said. All this was told to the grown-up James by his neighbor Claire. She called his mother Hannah Tales. His grandmother, on the other hand, never spoke ill of his mother, only sighed at her fate. Well, she also blamed herself for missing her daughter somewhere. Not looking out, James recalled. Claire, on the other hand, cut the truth straight and didn't try to soften the edges. Your mother's a beauty, I can't say. But she's lazy. And she wasn't very bright either. She wanted to fly high. She didn't have the brains to do the math. And so it turned out the way it did. It wasn't her grandmother and grandfather's fault. They did everything for their daughter. They're good people. It's probably just genes from Henry's family. That's why he grew up in an orphanage. Who puts their kids in an orphanage like that? Misguided. And only people like Hannah. If it wasn't for Grandma, you'd have had to grow up in an orphanage too. Hannah was barely 18. She ran away from her parents' home. And not to study in the city like many other village boys and girls, but after her fiancé. A guy from the city, a student, and a local boy came to visit them once in Seneki. His friend had come to see his parents, so he brought his fellow student with him. The groom's name was Ethan. He was also a student at the university and already drove his own car. His father had given it to him for his coming of age. Ethan was handsome and stylish, just like an actor from a youth show. Naturally, Hannah immediately met him. The village beauty charmed the young man. They had an instant romance. But Ethan took Hannah to the city. They started living together in his apartment. Ethan was studying, Hannah was a housewife. She didn't even study to get a foothold in the city. Cooking, scrubbing floors, that's all she did. Ethan and Hannah lived a well-to-do fun life thanks to the young man's father's money going out to clubs and restaurants, even traveling. Naturally, James went to the city and tried to bring his wayward daughter home. He understood where this was going, but she flatly refused to go. And there was nothing he could do. Hannah was already 18. So she had the right to run her own life as she saw fit. Hannah had spent too much time in the village. Her parents got her a job as a clerk in the local store, since she didn't want to study. She lived a miserable existence, dreaming of a beautiful life. She was angry at her fate, at her father and mother, at the local village boys who could not fulfill her dreams. What kept her from running away to the city, even to nowhere, were her parents. They were endlessly urging her to get smart, lecturing her, controlling her adult daughter, explaining it all with fear for her future. Hannah would have run away from them without a shame, but where and on what money? The girl tried to send her photos to a modeling agency, but to her own surprise, she did not receive any answers. Hannah thought that the offers would come at her like a cornucopia, but no such luck. She continued to think over the plan, communicated on dating sites, received a lot of compliments and offers, but she was afraid. Hannah hadn't seen these people in person. There's no telling who might be out there on the other side of the monitor. It was her parents who planted those fears in her, which made her hate them even more. And then Ethan showed up, a prince in a black Audi. He rescued the beautiful girl from captivity, took her away from the hated, dirty village, poor parents, moralizing. That's how Hannah perceived her departure. She had escaped, broken free. It didn't work out with Ethan. In the end, he quickly found someone else. But Hannah was in no hurry to return to the village. She had a new beau, lower in status than Major Ethan, but not bad either. That relationship didn't work out either. But a new one loomed ahead. Hannah lowered the bar in the choice of suitors. The suitors changed one after another. One thing remained unchanged: the girl lived at the expense of these people, gave them her tenderness, youth, beauty, and in return received a roof over her head, food, some gifts, trips to cafes and clubs. Life seemed to Hannah not quite what she had dreamed of, but she wasn't going back to the village. James and Patricia were heartbroken to see what their daughter was becoming. Her once golden curls had faded, her voice rough and hoarse. Her skin took on an unhealthy hue. Hannah drank heavily, started smoking. All this, of course, reflected on her health and appearance. James was very worried about the path his only daughter had taken. It was a huge shock to her father. Patricia hoped that Hannah would come to her senses and get her mind right. She'd had enough of such a life with one man, then another. And they were not such wealthy and handsome young men as Ethan. They were more like battered men of marginal appearance. James and Patricia worked somewhere, so they had money, and Hannah lived in the city at the expense of her admirers. She'd been transformed from a golden-haired princess into a gray woman with a dysfunctional appearance. It was hard to imagine that she had once looked so different. She had dreamed of a rich, beautiful life, spent hours perfecting her makeup. Hannah was going downhill fast and didn't seem to notice it at all. She felt happy and didn't want to go back to her parents. James's heart ached for his daughter, literally. The man had suffered 2 heart attacks in a row. Patricia was also worried, of course, but in her heart she hoped that everything would be all right. Hannah was still very young. But James, it seems, realized that nothing good could come out of Hannah. He didn't survive a 3rd heart attack. So Patricia was left all alone in the village house. No husband. Daughters living a wild life in the city. Yeah, it's not how she imagined her old age. At least she had a job. The woman still worked as a milkmaid on the farm. There's socializing, some kind of life there. And at home? Loneliness, cold, 4 walls. On New Year's Eve, an unprecedented event happened. Hannah came to her mother in the village. Patricia, seeing the dear guest, immediately began to clutter, to collect the table. Her daughter did not look well, pale, swollen face. When Hannah took off her jacket, Patricia gasped. Her belly was rounded under her sweater. Hannah was pregnant, and it looked like she'd been pregnant for a long time. It turned out that the father of the child is another suitor, Hannah Trucker. He rented an apartment in the city, earned good money, enough to live on, and to get drunk when he was not on a trip. Pregnancy, of course, no one planned. It just happened. Learning about what happened, the admirer was frightened. He admitted that he already has a family in another city, a wife and 2 children. He doesn't need heirs on the side. Gave him money to solve the problem. But Hannah was turned away at the hospital. All the terms were out, but there were no indications to terminate the pregnancy, as the child was developing well. It was surprising, considering that Hannah, being pregnant, did not deny herself alcohol. Further, everything was ridiculously banal. The admirer ran away, quickly disappeared. Hannah lived in their apartment for a few more months until the lease was up, but she had nowhere to go. Who would want her? She couldn't get another boyfriend, so she returned to her home village. Patricia hoped things would get better for them now, and the fact that the child will not have a father, so it's not a problem. She would manage, raise him, teach him, put him on his feet. The woman was counting on Hannah's maternal instincts to kick in, to change her and make her softer, more loving, more caring. It didn't work out. Hannah barely survived to give birth in the hated village. By the way, the baby was born prematurely weak and very small. He was nursed in the hospital for almost a month. Hannah immediately gave up her son. She didn't need him. And here and premature, obviously sick. So she gave up the baby at the hospital and went back to the city. Now she could again live in her own pleasure, go to cafes and restaurants in search of new love, have fun without a belly. Everything is better. Everything is easier. After learning about her daughter's deed, Patricia rushed to the maternity hospital, explained the situation to people. She was understood. The refusal documents were canceled. Patricia's neighbor's niece worked there as head doctor. That's how it was resolved through her. But we had to find Hannah. The baby's mother had to be present and sign the paperwork. Hannah at first insisted that she did not need her son, and it would be better for him to go to an orphanage. But Patricia convinced her daughter the boy should stay in the family. She found arguments: "I will take care of him. Do not be afraid. Live as you have lived. But you'll get an allowance for him. And a lot of money. You're a single mom." Patricia took this step for her grandson. Convinced her daughter to agree to it because of child support. Otherwise, Hannah would never have kept the baby. And Patricia would not have been given custody, and the conditions are not ideal, and the age is already solid. So little James stayed with his grandmother in the village. His mother, the beautiful Hannah, James knew only from the stories of his grandmother, neighbors, and their photos. The woman was not interested in the fate of the child, only occasionally came to his mother to rest between the next complex novels. A vague image remained in James's memory: a woman who smelled pungent, hoarse, unpleasant. She was yelling at his grandmother, demanding something, and little James was scared. But of course he couldn't remember his parent well, because Hannah had died when he was barely 4. Another roommate in a drunken brawl did not calculate forces. That's how Hannah's life ended, quite naturally. His grandmother told James many times that she had survived that period, after Hannah's death, only because of the little grandson she had to take care of. They didn't have much money, times were hard, and a milkmaid's wages were not luxurious. But James considered his childhood happy, energetic, strong, caring grandmother, friends, soft bed, the aroma of pies and fried potatoes. Yes, James did not have an expensive computer, game consoles, branded sneakers, what is considered the ultimate joy for teenagers. But he never went hungry or wore rags. James tried to help his grandmother with everything. Growing up, he realized that life at home and loved one was not easy. Restless boy tried to please her as much as he could. True, to study well did not work. Grandmother engaged with him, tried to explain complex topics, but did not add up something in his head. And that's it, said the neighbor of the grandmother, Claire. That's because Hannah drank while she was carrying him. They were sitting in the kitchen drinking tea and thought James couldn't hear a thing. Yeah, but who cares? Grandma waved her hand. The main thing is that he's healthy, strong, and kind. Not everyone has to be a scientist. And James will find his place in life. He's so handy. Like his grandfather, I suppose. James was really good at fixing things, making things, that's him. And no one taught him how to do it on purpose. He watched other people do it and picked it up on the fly. Not like math. By the time James finished school, the financial situation of their small family had completely deteriorated. The farm paid a pittance. His grandmother's pension was also very small, especially compared to the ever-increasing prices. James worked part-time, mending neighbors' fences and cutting people's grass, digging potatoes, even helping to build houses. But the earnings were irregular and small. With those grades in the certificate, James had no sense to think about college, let alone university. But the boy still decided to go to the city. There are more opportunities to earn money there, to settle in life. And his grandmother needs financial help. She's been dragging him down so much already. Go, Patricia said yes. You're a serious guy with a backbone. I'm not as worried about you as I was about Hannah. You won't be lost. You won't go off the straight and narrow. Just be careful. You're still young, and there's so much danger out there. Don't worry, Grandma. James put his arm around his grandmother's shoulders. Everything will be fine. I'll go to the construction site as a laborer. I can knead cement, lay bricks, and plaster and paint. I'm a jack of all trades, in general. I'll definitely find a use for me there. I'll earn for an apartment, and I'll take you right away. Grandmother smiled, but her eyes were still sad, even though she'd said James wouldn't be lost. She must have had a premonition of trouble. The city stunned James at first. Crowds of rushing people, streams of cars. No, the boy, of course, had been to the city before. But it was one thing to come with his grandmother to do some shopping or file some paperwork, and quite another to be here for a long time alone, to become a resident of this noisy metropolis. Where to start? Where to go? James found several advertisements in advance, back in the village. At the construction site often needed workers. So he decided to try young, strong. This guy was gladly hired to build another supermarket. The object was almost ready. Finishing works were left. The crew was running out of time. They needed helpers. James fit the bill. He was even provided with accommodation, a caravan hut. True, he had to share it with the workers, but it was nothing, but it was free. Having received the first money, James immediately rented an apartment. He wanted to start looking for a new job, but the job found him. One of the workers, who lived with James in the apartment, called him to the new object. "They'll pay well," the bearded man assured him. "As soon as we get the results, we'll get the money." James didn't object to this settlement scheme. He had money saved from his previous earnings, so he didn't worry about what he would have to live on all this time. The work was going on, the arguments. James was anticipating that pretty soon he would have some good money. Then he could send some of it to his grandmother. He knew she had debts, borrowing from neighbors to send her grandson to the city. She was afraid to let the guy go without any money at all. Soon he'll pay her back with a raise. She'll be so happy. It didn't work out. This time the owners simply screwed the laborers. Maybe it was the bearded man who took James' money and ran off with it. Maybe he was the cheater, realized James was a naive rookie. It was useless to appeal to the police or the labor inspectorate. No one signed official contracts with the workers. No one would take his word for it. James was in a desperate situation. The money he had set aside had run out. He had no money to pay the rent, and there was almost no money left for bread. James spent days running around the city looking for work. As luck would have it, unskilled laborers were not needed anywhere. And then one day, after another unsuccessful attempt to get a job at a construction site, James wandered towards the bus stop. He was filled with a variety of unpleasant feelings: fear, despair, resentment. And then someone called out to him. "Hey kid, are you looking for a job?" James turned around. Behind him stood two guys about 25 years old, tall, tanned to black. They were construction laborers. They work on the street, hence the calluses, the tanned faces, and the broad palms, glowing with mud. "I'm looking," James nodded. "And just because we need help. It's not a big deal. Just one thing to unload into a car. But the pay is good." A doubt crept into James's soul. What if he was being deceived again? He didn't want to step on the same toes again. He wanted to try to get an official job. But there was no way out. He had to stay in the city to find a job. You got to pay rent, you got to have money for food. So he decided to take a risk. "I'm with you," he said. "All right," replied the man. "So we'll meet here tonight at 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock tonight, James clarified, and it seemed strange. Why so late? "The owners are leaving late. We'll go in after them, start taking everything out. They don't want to be involved in all this fuss, so they're paying well." James shrugged. The rich have their quirks. "I'll be there," he promised his new acquaintances. James was there at the right time. The guys he'd arranged with were late, or maybe they wouldn't show up at all. James wouldn't be too upset. Sure, he needed the money, but these men looked too suspicious. There was insincerity in them, falseness. James kept thinking they'd cheat him, not pay him, like the bearded man. But the guys showed up a few minutes late, but they came. Or rather, they arrived when an old, broken-down, open-body truck pulled into the parking lot. James didn't even look at it, didn't even think it was after him. But the driver's door swung open, and one of James' daytime companions looked out. "What are you standing there for? Get in. We're already late," he said. James obeyed and got into the seat next to the driver. The other guy was here too. He said a discreet hello and stared out the window again. Unlike his buddy, this second guy was silent and frowning. They drove for a long time, almost an hour, first through the city, then the highway, then a country road. Everything that was happening seemed increasingly suspicious to James, but he realized that at this point there was unlikely to be a quick and easy way out of the case. At best, the two men would drop him off at night without a dime in his pocket somewhere outside the city. At worst. He didn't even want to think about that. The driver was joking now and then, smiling. James had a strong feeling that he was playing the brave guy, trying to seem calm and relaxed, but he was worried. The other was silent, as usual. He didn't react to his buddy's words, just stared at the road. Finally, the truck stopped near a plot of land enclosed by a high fence. The driver opened the gate with a key. James exhaled as long as he had the keys. Then everything was really okay. "You stay in the yard. We're going in the house." The driver ordered. "We'll be handing you the boxes. You put them in the back of the truck. We'll be done in no time." The boys went into the house. James noted that they also had a key to the front door. It was silent and dark, the kind of darkness that only happened in the countryside. Large stars peered down from the sky. James involuntarily admired the night sky. He thought of his hometown. He thought of his grandmother, wondering what she was doing now. Probably drinking tea with Grandma Claire in the cozy kitchen. And old women were always talking about him, about James. I felt like going home to the only person I'd ever known. He wanted to be a little boy again, for whom his grandmother was a loving and all-powerful being. The driver's hoarse voice interrupted James from his pleasant thoughts. "What are you dreaming about?" "Standing like a pillar. Take the box." James obediently dragged the container into the truck as agreed. The box was heavy. I wondered what was inside: books, dishes, maybe just some household stuff. No sooner had James returned to the front porch than the silence of the September night was broken by the wail of a police siren. The darkness was struck by the glow of a flashing beacon. James had hoped that the police cars would drive past the station to the scene of the accident. But they stopped right outside the gate. What happened next happened quickly. James's brain was fixating on individual frames. Here the garden fills with uniformed men. Some of them rush into the house, another part starts to search the plot. James is rolled to the ground lightly, as if he weighs nothing. His arms are twisted painfully behind his back. His face is tickled by dry grasses. Sand is stuffed into his nose and mouth. James sneezes once or twice. It's hard to breathe. Someone roughly turns James' face sideways. The boy gulps greedily for air. On the dark womb of a police van, James sits handcuffed on a hard bench. There are uniformed men nearby. The driver and the other guy are nowhere to be seen. They seem to have escaped. That's what James deduces from the scraps of phrases exchanged between the law. "Where are your accomplices?" James is approached by a stout man in camouflage. "Do you know where they went?" James shakes his head negatively. He wants to explain to these people that those who ran away are not his accomplices, that they met for the first time only this morning, that these guys just offered him a job, and James needed the money. But James doesn't say anything. First of all, they're not likely to believe him. The guy replayed his speech in his head and realized it sounds very improbable. Secondly, his tongue became alien from fear, as if it were too big and clumsy. And my mouth was dry. He was very thirsty, but James didn't dare to ask the policeman for water. "Do you even know whose cottage you are going to rob?" The man in the camouflage turned to the terrified boy again. "Samantha's attorney. The summer house." "I'll give you assholes the full program now," said the man in camouflage. Then James was interrogated. The investigator, a middle-aged man with a tired, angry look, asked him questions like a hardened criminal. James told the truth. He wasn't believed, of course. Who would have doubted it? The two men had escaped, gone into hiding. They were being searched for. James had assumed that the cops wouldn't succeed. Now, he was sure he'd met experienced criminals. They'd probably get away with it. But what would happen to him? James was sent to the holding cell until morning. Black cell, hard bunks, a very special, indescribable odor. A calm and silent neighbor who didn't even ask what James was in jail for. All day long, the big, scowling man lay on his shelf and stared at the ceiling. Sometimes he would be taken somewhere, and then James would be alone. It turned out that the truck the thieves had come to get him in had been reported stolen. They decided to pin it on James, too. There was no use explaining to the men in uniform that James couldn't drive a car. "I haven't had time to learn. I don't even have a license. It's easy to check," he said. "We've got half the country driving without a license." "That's not a handicap," he replied. The trial was held unexpectedly quickly. Only a few days after the arrest, the grandmother was present at the hearing. She had been informed in time. James didn't expect to see her. He was in the defendant's seat. All the evidence was against him. He was ashamed to look his grandmother in the eye, even though James realized that he was not guilty of anything. But his grandmother doesn't know. She must think he's a criminal. Grandma looked thin and old all at once. There were shadows under her eyes. There were more wrinkles. Her gaze was troubled, sad, but loving. She looked at James without judgment, with tenderness and love. It gave the boy strength. When the judge announced the verdict, James' eyes darkened. He realized he wouldn't be acquitted, but he had hoped for a much lighter sentence. He even secretly wished for house arrest. He wasn't a repeat offender, after all. 8 years in a strict regime colony, the judge's verdict sounded ruthlessly. Grandma gasped, clutched her heart, and grew old before her eyes. So what is it? He's a child, he almost stumbled. He was confused by adult criminals. They tricked him and ran away. It's clear as day, she wailed. And James went to a colony in another region. The long gray days dragged on like twins. Wake up, a meager breakfast, work in the industrial zone, a walk in the cramped prison yard, sometimes searches and inspections. Lunch, dinner, periodic medical examinations. Occasional holidays for the prisoners. The dreary monotony, the peculiar odor, the filth, the despair, the fear. James was always lucky with his neighbors. They were much more human than the guards. Each had his own complicated fate. James, as the youngest, was even pitied in his own way. They realized that it was bad luck for a young naive boy to meet dangerous people on his way. James now had a lot of time to think. He was going through his universities, getting to know people, getting to know life. Now the guy was clearly realizing how naive and stupid he had been. James wouldn't fall for such a trick again. He'd do things differently. But you don't fight back. Sometimes James had a visit from his grandmother. Each visit, James noticed new wrinkles on her face. The boy was getting older, and his grandmother was getting older. James knew that she now had heart problems, and he realized who was responsible for the illness of his own. Of course, worrying about his grandson did its job, rewarded the grandmother with a serious ailment. She needed an operation, but it cost money. And where to get it? James knew that the grandmother had tried several times to appeal for leniency for her grandson, even hired lawyers. But it hadn't worked out. James had answered to the full extent of the law, and only because the victims included a prosecutor. And those people are known to have a lot of connections. How many times during these 8 years James dreamed of going back to that unfortunate day and refused the offer of 2 strangers to earn money? His whole life would have turned out differently. "It's okay, grandson." "With everything happens," calmed his grandmother. "Calm down, everything will be all right." James tried to be brave in front of her. But she saw everything, understood everything. "You've been duped, it's all right. The price is high, but it's just the beginning of life. When you get out, we'll make up for it. Everything will be fine," she said. James smiled. His grandmother's words made him feel lighter and warmer. And it really did feel like everything would work out. The main thing was that he had someone who loved him, who waited, who would never deceive or betray him. And then his grandmother suddenly disappeared. James was worried when she didn't show up for his birthday. Usually she always showed up by that date, and then there was no sign of her. His grandmother's phone didn't answer. James asked the guards several times for permission to use his cell phone. The guards were kind people too, even though they weren't supposed to be. They let the prisoners make calls. But these calls were useless. Just long beeps, that's all. And then James finally got called to the visiting room. The guy flew there like he was on wings. He was relieved. He imagined hugging his grandmother, telling her he missed her so much. But on the familiar gray sofa sat his neighbor, Grandma Claire. She was tense, anxious. "Hello, James," she said, hugging her neighbor awkwardly. "You've lost a lot of weight. Don't they feed you here?" Then, in a broken voice, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief, Grandma Claire told James the terrible news. "Patricia's dead. She had a heart attack. So the ambulance didn't get here in time. How was I supposed to wait for you? I was dreaming, making plans," sobbed Grandma Claire. You could see that she had not yet come to terms with the loss of her friend neighbor. "I couldn't wait. The neighbors organized the funeral. I thought someone was trying to get you to go and say goodbye to your grandmother. No way. It's not allowed, that's all. Not that they didn't let me go. They didn't even tell me about the tragedy." "How come? How could it be?" James mumbled. "How can I come home and she's gone?" "There's nowhere to go." Claire looked at him confused. "Don't you know that?" It turns out that after James went to prison, Grandma Patricia had taken out a lot of loans. Thought a good lawyer would get her favorite grandson out of jail. Only it didn't work out even with good lawyers. The loans were secured against the house. Consequently, when the owner died, the property went to the bank. It was another blow, much less sensitive than the first, but still. The house isn't just a house. It's James's place of power. A quiet, cozy harbor with which the guy has a lot of pleasant associations, warm memories. And now what? Someone alien would live there. Since then, James felt lonely and not needed by anyone. No grandmother. Then why is he on this earth? What for? He used to think to please his grandmother, to watch over her in her old age. He was working hard for her, striving for something. Now what's it all for? But you've got to make a living. So James adapted to the cold and darkness of prison. He ate, slept, worked, everything was automatic. His mind was constantly replaying scenes from his childhood, when his grandmother was still young and strong. And he promised her that he would support his grandmother in her old age. But the grandmother never lived to be old. Liberation did not bring the expected joy. Rather the opposite. Where to go, what to do, where to sleep, what to eat. There were more questions than answers. At least James had a small amount of money saved up over the years of working in the industrial zone. He went to the city with it. Where else? He's bruised. James realized that no one was waiting for him in the village. Even though Grandma Claire said she'd be willing to take him in. She invited him to visit her after his release, but the guy realized that these were just polite words. Why would she want a felon in her house? In the city, James spent money on hotel and food. The savings melted away in a week, but it was also the beginning of hard times. There were a lot of things and had to sleep on the street and get into street fights and eat from the dumpster. James got sick a couple times, so he thought he'd never make it. And even was glad of this outcome, but the young body recovered again and again. And no one needed gray, dull, joyless life continued. James tried begging. He got a serious beating for it. It turned out to be a whole business, and you can't just enter it by choice. The guy went through the dumpsters and the bins near restaurants and cafes. There was always something to eat, and in the city dump you could find clothes in season. James didn't even want to think about what he'd become. A dirty, ragged bum. If his grandmother had seen him. No, this wasn't how he'd imagined growing up. He was disgusted with himself. Then one day James was walking past a house under construction and noticed that the workers weren't laying the tiles correctly. It turned out that not all the construction skills were out of his head yet. The foreman was surprised, looking at the homeless man incredulously. Then followed his advice. Appreciated the result, smiled. And the unbelievable happened. James was offered a job. Of course, he jumped at the opportunity. The foreman's name was Henry. He had his own small construction company. The guys were engaged in minor repairs, construction of small buildings. And the crew needed some smart guys. So James got a job. The pay, of course, was not much, but the man was happy about it. After so many years of hunger and wandering, a permanent job seemed like a gift from fate. Henry appreciated James for his diligence and dexterity. Over time, he learned the young man's story and helped him settle into life a little. For example, he told him that it was not necessary to rent a whole apartment or live in a hotel. It was too expensive. It is much more profitable in James's position to sleep in a hostel. It turns out that in the city there are such budget lodgings, huge rooms filled with bunk beds. To rent a place for the night in such an establishment cost a penny. Now James was falling asleep in a warm bed. Dozens of neighbors snored around him, but that didn't bother the man, who was used to much harsher conditions. James had a job to do. He no longer slept outside, and Henry had become something of a mentor to the man who'd been thrown to the wayside, helping him with paperwork, big purchases, hospitalizations, and so on. Henry advised James to start saving for his own place. You can't stay in a hostel forever. A man needs his own place, even if not a luxurious apartment, but at least a small one on the outskirts, so that there was a place to lay his head. And James began to save little by little, month by month. The man always kept his savings with him. He made a secret pocket in his shirt. When Henry found out about it, he grabbed his head. "Are you out of your mind? Who does that? How? James didn't understand. Where am I supposed to leave them? Like burying a treasure in the ground in the woods? Not as treasure, but as a deposit. You and I are going to open a bank account. James was afraid to entrust his hard-earned money to a bank. He'd been cheated many times in his life, and brutally so, but Henry convinced him. And now homeless James even had his own account. The man funded it with regularity. The numbers kept climbing. Someday James would be able to realize his dream and buy a house or an apartment. Living in a hostel had its advantages. James often met a variety of people. Amazing fates, sometimes complicated, sometimes even scary. Lots of different stories. People in the hostel were like fellow travelers on trains, generously sharing details of their life stories with each other. It was fascinating. James regretted that he'd never learned to read and write. If he had been able to write well, he would have published a thick collection of stories. People would be interested in reading about the lives of others. Some of the stories were a veritable treasure trove of wisdom and experience. One day, the bunk shelf next to James's bed was occupied by a new neighbor. He was a man a little older than James himself. He didn't come alone, but with a boy about 6 years old. The child and the man looked uncannily alike. The same green eyes with a slightly sly squint, copper-red hair, and a face and hands like Pushkin's. It's clear at once father and son. Henry and Louis is small. Louis, like most of the hostel's permanent residents, had a hard history with these people. James recognized it around the third, fourth day of being neighbors with the red-haired couple. Henry, much like James, had grown up in the village. He had been raised by his mother. The man never knew his father. They lived poorly, but they didn't starve. There was always food in the house. His mother worked, Henry studied, tried hard. He had a dream of becoming a lawyer. It seemed to the boy that people in this profession are practically heavenly. They help resolve disputes, do justice, and, importantly, earn good money. So they can afford an apartment in a big city, a beautiful car, travel to the sea. You see, I wanted to take my mother to the sea, Henry told James in a confidential whisper. The lights were off in the room. There was the sound of snoring coming from the many bunks in the hostel. Little Louis was asleep, too, curled up under the blanket. Henry and James were having a conversation. A pleasant, almost friendly conversation. James told his neighbor about his fate. It happened by itself, simply and naturally. And Henry responded with frankness to frankness. Henry realized that it was hard for his mother to carry him alone. He wished he could grow up, get on his feet, make her life a fairy tale. Mother had never been to the sea. She couldn't pay for such a trip, but she dreamed of going. Henry saw she watched movies about the sea, took a long look at pictures of acquaintances from beach vacations. I think she even dreamed about the sea. Anyway, Henry entered college to study law, went to the city, settled in a dormitory. His mother stayed in the village. The boy's dreams were shattered gradually. He learned that lawyers are not always on the side of truth. Often you have to adjust to the situation, to people. This was discovered in practice in court, and the tasks that are solved by representatives of this profession often have nothing to do with something heroic. The majority of lawyers are engaged in real estate registration or at all papers or going through in offices for pennies. That's how one of the college professors put it. And Henry had no reason not to trust him. The kid's down. He thought it was worth it to enroll, and that's it. Fate was settled. A happy future was guaranteed. But no. Still, Henry tried, he studied. After all, there were other lawyers, fighters for justice, defenders of the wronged and oppressed. It was hard to break through, of course, but there's always a chance. A small one, though. The older Henry grew, the clearer he realized that everywhere you need connections and money. And he, a country boy, had neither. Henry finished his college and got a job in the housing and utilities sector, working for a pittance, just as the teacher had predicted. There were plenty of lawyers looking for work at the time, so the inexperienced college graduate was glad to have the job. Now he's on the labor exchange. He rented a room in a dormitory and adjusted his life. His mother was happy for her son. After all, in the city he got a grip, made his way. She was the only person who believed in Henry's brilliant future. And this faith kept the guy afloat, forced him to move forward. He worked in the housing and utilities sector, but was looking for more interesting options, No luck, though. All the good jobs were occupied firmly and for a long time. It seems that there were even queues of the right people for them. But Henry tried not to be discouraged. He had little doubt that sooner or later luck would smile on him. And then his mother died. Henry lowered his head. Even in the semi-darkness, James could see that the man was barely holding back tears. It was obvious that the wound had not yet healed. The heart. And as the doctor said later, he should have gone to the hospital for surgery a long time ago. And Mom. She kept thinking it would go away, taking pills, putting off going to the hospital. I know why they wouldn't let her off work. No, of course they would have. Sick leave, sick leave. But while she was getting treatment, they would have fired her somehow. They'd find a way. It's happened in our village before. Everyone needs healthy young workers. And Mom? She was afraid of being left without money because she had no one to rely on. I was no good as a protector and benefactor. I was barely making ends meet myself. How could I blame myself for that? For not being my mother's rock. I didn't have the time. Henry was taking the loss hard. The realization came gradually. James understood his tablemate as well as anyone. Henry's story seemed to take him back to the time when he was suddenly without his grandmother. James had felt the same way, and he too had blamed himself endlessly for not keeping his loved ones safe. I don't know what would have happened to me in the end, Henry continued. Maybe I would have lived like a robot. Maybe I would have done something stupid. All sorts of thoughts were running through my head at the time. It's hard to even think about it now. But then Shelley came into my life. And everything started to, I don't even know how to explain it. Anyway, she got me out. Shelley got a job as a janitor at the same utility company where Henry worked. She was a sweet, modest girl with constantly troubled gray eyes framed by fluffy eyelashes. Henry didn't notice her at first. Newcomers often showed up and then left. The turnover was due to a combination of heavy workloads, neglectful bosses, and very modest salaries. But one day the guy literally bumped into Shelley in the hallway. He was in a hurry to get to the next office and bumped into a girl moving toward him. How did he not notice? Shelley gasped. Henry grabbed her by the shoulders, holding her up so she wouldn't fall. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. He was about to continue on his way when he saw her eyes. No, of course, Henry had met Shelley before in the yard at work, in line at the cash register, and in general. He'd glimpsed her in the cafeteria, but he'd never noticed her. After his mother's death, everything around him was gray and inexpressive. There was little that interested Henry, little that attracted his attention. But those eyes were bottomless lakes, impossible to look away from. Touching eyes like a Disney cartoon. So much anxiety in them, so much awe. Henry suddenly felt like someone strong, confident, almost omnipotent. He wanted to be near her, to take care of her, to protect her from the dangers of this life. For the first time since the tragedy, the boys suddenly felt alive. They stopped right there in the corridor. Each of them had forgotten where they were going. Henry apologized for running into the girl, smiled. Shelley began to assure him it was no big deal, word by word, and somehow the young people agreed to go on their first date. That's the story of an acquaintance. It soon became clear that Shelley and Henry had a lot in common. First, they were the same age. Secondly, at their young ages, both are already having to make their own way in this life. Neither Shelley nor Henry had any older relatives ready to help them in life, to become mentors and support, or close friends. That's just the way it is. Shelley grew up in an orphanage. She knew nothing about her parents except that both were alcoholics on the street. That's the characterization the teacher used when she told the girl about her past. The child was taken away from the marginalized couple because the girl was in danger with her parents. Did these people love her? Were they trying to bring her back? Shelley didn't know for sure, but she assumed not. Because if to other pupils at least sometimes someone came swollen, unkempt mothers with dirty lollipops, strange-looking homeless fathers, decrepit grandmothers lowered, lost, but still relatives and not indifferent people, then Shelley in general nobody and never visited. And she wanted to see her own, to feel their love. The girl would forgive these people everything, would accept them and understand. But no one came. Life in the orphanage was not easy. Cruel children, angry teachers. Quiet, humble Shelley had a hard time. She lived her life waiting for the next blow, the next bullying. The kids sensed the quiet ones and used them for their own amusement. Shelley was locked in a dark bathroom at night. She was robbed of New Year's gifts donated to orphanages from the city government. Her clothes were often stained with paint or plasticine. More than once, Shelley was beaten just to show her strength and superiority. And the girl could neither fight back nor complain. One day, Shelley told the teachers about the bullying of her peers. She herself was blamed. Adults said that she needed to be more communicative. She needed to find a common language with other people, scared her with diagnoses. But the offenders were punished. But Shelley didn't feel any better. On the contrary, she was then spotted in the yard, dragged behind the gazebo and beaten again for complaining. The girl never asked adults for help again. Shelley didn't study very well, and she would have liked to be an excellent student. She reached for knowledge, read a lot, but it did not work. It was impossible to learn her lessons. Other pupils interfered. They made noise, molested, and even, sometimes, took away notebooks and textbooks. In the orphanage, striving for knowledge and diligent study was considered something shameful. Shelley was called a nerd. Bookworm was demeaned. In general, no one in the orphanage really studied, and the teachers gave lessons for a tick. Once Shelley even heard a conversation between teachers. The math teacher contemptuously threw the teacher of Russian, "Why are you prostrating yourself in front of these morons? They won't be of any use anyway. They'll follow in the footsteps of their miserable parents, or bruises won't be born oranges." Shelley had tears in her eyes. Is that how they treat them? No. She'd known before that the orphanage's residents weren't particularly favored. But it was one thing to assume, but it was another to hear herself say it. The worst part was, Shelley knew the teacher was right. That's just the way it is. Probably having overheard that conversation, Shelley realized it's not worth dreaming about happiness, about a bright future. Nothing good was going to happen to her, and she shouldn't even try. Shelley went to college to become a pastry chef. She studied, knowing full well that she was unlikely to find a place in her specialty. It was too narrow a specialty, and she wasn't very good at it. Her hands did not obey well and could not repeat the operations that the teachers showed her. Shelley realized at the beginning that this was not her path, but all the orphans, their girls, were sent to learn to be pastry chefs. So she was sent. "It's okay," the group's supervisor, an unexpectedly warm-hearted, caring woman, reassured her. She somehow immediately took to Shelley, took pity on her, which was quite unusual. Not many people work in the profession. "You'll find yourself in life now. Girl, don't worry." Having reached adulthood, Shelley graduated from the orphanage. It was a day she greeted with joy. Deliverance at last. A confusing adult life lay ahead. Now she'd have to make her own way. No one is responsible for her now. But at least the end of bullying peers and cruel punishments of educators. Shelley was given an apartment on the outskirts of town by the state. It's an old, 3-story house. Creaky floors, piles of garbage. The room was tiny, but it was her own place. An island of tranquility where Shelley found herself a full-fledged mistress. At first, the girl was even dizzy. She could do whatever she wanted, cook something delicious in her own kitchen, lie in bed and read without fear that someone would take her book away from her. Watch late into the night on a hand-bought TV, an old, cracked screen. So what? It works. For the first time, Shelley lived on the money that had accumulated in her account during her stay in the orphanage. Each pupil received a certain amount of money, but the graduates were warned that they had to find a job before the savings ran out. Shelley knew it was really important. She'd seen how fast the money was being spent, especially since at first she was inexperienced and didn't know how to save money. Then she learned how to save money. As Shelley expected, she couldn't get a job as a pastry chef, and it wasn't her profession. The girl understood everything about herself and evaluated her skills quite adequately. Fortunately, there were many other options. Shelley tried to work as a cashier in a supermarket, but it didn't work out. It required quickness, somewhere assertiveness, boldness, somewhere even the skill of a psychologist. Shelley couldn't count money fast enough, she couldn't serve customers quickly, and everyone was always dissatisfied with her. And at the end of the shift, Shelley had a shortage, which was deducted, of course, from her salary. As a result, the girl received pennies, which were not even enough for food. It was good that her orphan savings had not been completely used up yet, and one day Shelley owed her master a month's wages. The salary wasn't enough to cover the shortfall. so Shelley quit her job to stay out of trouble. There's no telling what kind of shortage she'll get next time. Shelley started looking for work again. Now her situation was desperate. She had no money at all. Luckily, her neighbor Olivia helped. She told her that the utility company was looking for janitors. Shelley, without hesitation, grabbed the offer. About the work of a janitor, the girl at that time had the vaguest ideas. Already in the course of business, Shelley realized that this work is to her liking. It's nice to spend time in the fresh air. It's nice to communicate with the residents of the house. It's nice to make the territory cleaner. It's nice to hear the words of gratitude for the timely removal of dry leaves and sanded slippery paths. Fate prepared another surprise. It brought Henry together. Young people who were all alone in the world suddenly found each other, and it was happiness for both of them. Henry and Shelley didn't meet for long. A couple of months after they met, they had already formalized their relationship and started living together in a small apartment. Shelley was happy to have Henry's hand as a man, and the house became even cozier and more comfortable. The young husband had split the ceilings, painted the walls, fixed a long leaking faucet, even replaced the wiring. He loved fixing up their dwelling. Shelley took care of Henry, cooked him delicious lunches and dinners, ironed his shirts, and most importantly, was interested in how his day was going. Perhaps that was the most enjoyable part. Both Shelley and Henry felt important, needed, loved. Now they were not alone on the entire planet. Life took on a whole new color. And then a wonderful thing happened. Shelley told her husband that she was expecting a child. The couple didn't seem to be planning an heir so soon, but the news made them both happy, of course, and it was scary how they would cope with the baby. They do not have anyone who would help, who would prompt, and whether they have enough money for such a luxury. And yet joyful emotions clearly prevailed in the range of stormy feelings of the future parents. Henry took a risky step. He quit his job at the housing and utilities company, which paid pennies, and got a job as a lawyer for a private lawyer. The latter offered him a much more respectable salary, but also more work. He had to study a lot, to understand the nuances of complicated cases, to sit in the office late into the night. Henry did it so that Shelley could quit her job. He rightly believed that the physical labor of janitorial work could be bad for the pregnancy. The man's salary was now quite high, but he was a private citizen. His business had its ups and downs and was sometimes jeopardized. Still, Henry didn't regret his decision. Shelley settled down at home and took over the household. Both spouses looked forward to the arrival of the baby. And then he was born small, warm, shrieking from the first days, looking remarkably like his father, the same green eyes and red hair. Shelley and Henry melted into the care of the baby. The boy was named Louis. Shelley had decided that. It was the name of one of her favorite book characters. Henry didn't mind Louis, a wonderful name. It turned out that a baby was really quite expensive. Diapers, special food, clothes that the baby grew out of lightning fast. Not to mention medicines, strollers, cribs, toys. Henry was getting by. He worked hard just so his family wouldn't need anything. They had food, they had necessities. They paid their rent. Of course, the young family couldn't afford anything extra. Trips to the sea, dinners in restaurants, expensive gadgets, all this was still inaccessible. But the spouses were not discouraged. It seemed to both of them that everything was still ahead of them. Shelley was busy with the baby in the house. Henry was working, and all would have been well, except that with Louis' arrival, Shelley's cramped apartment had become a mess. Not only did the number of tenants increase, but also the amount of stuff. Soon the couple realized they needed to expand. Louis was growing up. He needed more and more space, ideally his own room. A studio apartment would do, but then at least it would be newer and more spacious. And the family didn't particularly like the neighborhood. School and kindergarten were far away. The nearest bus stop was also about a 15-minute walk away. That's okay in the summer, but in the winter, it's a long walk. So Henry and Shelley thought about it and decided they needed a mortgage. The money for the down payment could be obtained from the sale of Shelley's cramped old apartment and Henry's country house, inherited from his mother. Of course, it was a risky endeavor, losing the whole place and going into debt all at once. But Henry had a good salary at the time. Louis was getting older, and the time was approaching when Shelley would be able to go to work. The payment seemed manageable to the couple. And so it began. At first, everything was going just fine. They found buyers quickly, even for the farmhouse, although Henry sensed big problems with it. The proceeds went partly toward the down payment on the mortgage, partly toward renovations. Shelley and Henry took a spacious one-bedroom apartment in a new neighborhood, bright, clean, and no one had ever lived in it before. The renovation was done quickly. They had the money. They furnished the rooms with inexpensive but fresh and modern furniture. They hung beautiful curtains and decorated the walls with framed photographs. The pictures were of Shelley, Henry, and little Louis. Henry liked to remember the first New Year's Eve in the new place. They had just finished remodeling. The room still had that distinctive smell of glue and new furniture straight from the store. Beautiful, clean, cozy. A huge, almost ceiling-high Christmas tree occupied the corner of the living room near the window. Little Louis, in his funny pajamas, stared mesmerized at the flashing lights of the garlands that decorated the fluffy beauty. The overhead lights went out. The garlands and the flickering TV screen created a cozy, almost fairy tale atmosphere. Henry looked at his wife and son sitting on the couch and at the neatly set table with incredibly tasty dishes: potatoes and chicken, salads, fruit, and of course champagne. What's New Year's Eve without champagne? At that moment, Henry felt happy and peaceful. His favorite relatives were nearby. It seemed that things would only get better from now on. Henry was pleased with himself. He had done it all. He had succeeded. What he had never dreamed of had come true. On that magical, calm evening, the couple had no idea what trials fate was already preparing for them. It all began the very next year. Louise grew up to kindergarten. The baby got used to preschool surprisingly easily. No caprices and tantrums, no endless illnesses, which frightened young parents of acquaintances. Everything went smoothly. Shelley went to work. She was lucky she was hired as a kitchen assistant in a restaurant. The work was not particularly hard and responsible, and the salary was much higher than that of a janitor. The mortgage payment was a big part of the family's expenses, so the extra money came in handy. Then, in the fall, misfortunes fell upon Shelley and Henry one after another. The blossoming young woman suddenly began to weaken. Dizziness, nausea, loss of appetite. At first, Alan and Shelley assumed pregnancy. Both were afraid they were not yet ready for a second child, primarily financially. The couple realized they couldn't afford it, but there was no question of getting rid of the baby. In general, they gathered their courage and went to the doctor. In the women's counseling, couple was shocked no pregnancy, but Shelley's tests turned out to be alarming. The woman was strongly recommended to be examined by a therapist. Shelley, of course, made an appointment. The examinations took up a lot of her time and energy. She had to constantly take time off from work, which of course did not please her boss. During this period, his wife's eyes were guilty, anxious, and confused. Henry's heart shrank with pity when he looked at his wife. But the man still believed that everything would be all right. A vitamin deficiency or a malfunctioning organ? No problem, they would find the cause, treat it, and everything would be as before. The diagnosis sounded like a thunderclap: the rarest blood disease, presumably hereditary. Shelley couldn't check. The doctors guessed she didn't know anything about her relatives. And what did it matter where the disease came from? The main thing was that the treatment was long, expensive, and there was no guarantee. Doctors with ruthless truthfulness immediately outlined the most likely scenario. Most likely the disease, despite treatment, will progress. All medical manipulations can only briefly delay the inevitable. Shelley was quite resistant to her diagnosis, or maybe she was just pretending to be, braving it for the sake of her husband and son. Henry, on the other hand, felt like he'd been hit over the head with a sandbag. For a long time he felt stunned, completely disoriented. How could it be? Where had the trouble come from all of a sudden? After all, they had just made it out, just started a new life. They had so many plans, so many wonderful ideas. Then Henry came to his senses, accepted the situation, and began to act. First of all, Henry began to look for doctors who had experience in treating patients like his wife. It wasn't cheap, to put it mildly. He had to sell a few things, take out some loans. And then there was the mortgage. Henry was working alone again. Shelley was weakened, and the treatment was taking up most of her time. Louis was happy, not sick, well-behaved, more and more conscious and independent. He understood that Mom was sick, Dad had to work a lot, and learned to serve himself, to dress, cook breakfast, make sandwiches. The little boy grew up before his eyes. People around him praised Louis, setting him as an example to their children. Henry wished all this had never happened. He wished his son didn't know how to tie his shoelaces or make an omelet like other kids his age. Shelley wasn't helped by the medical treatment they could afford. The family went into debt, but it was all for nothing. The young woman was fading, a pale shadow of herself. Henry pounded the thresholds of charitable foundations, tried to get the advice of eminent professors. The latter sometimes succeeded. Only these luminaries of medicine divorced their hands. Shelley's disease was poorly understood, unpredictable. No one knew how to help the young woman. Conventional treatments had little effect on her. Eventually, Shelley was admitted to an inpatient hospital. At that point, she had been sick for about 3 years. The woman couldn't even eat anymore, she was so weak. Henry prepared for a long struggle, even found a nurse who would take care of his wife more carefully for a fee. It didn't work. Shelley didn't live 24 hours after she was admitted to the hospital. Henry couldn't believe what had happened. He was once again experiencing a terrible, unfair loss. The situation was made worse by the fact that the man was now responsible for more than just himself. He had a son. And Louis somehow had to explain that his mother was gone. And then another blow: Henry lost his job. The law firm where he'd worked for the last few years went bankrupt. The owner of the company was always on the edge, taking risks for big profits. So he miscalculated one day. So Henry was also out of a job. After all, during Shelley's illness, the family had accumulated a lot of debts, and the mortgage payment was a heavy burden. Henry found a new job. It paid much less, but there was no other way out. It's not easy to get a good job. That time Henry was lucky to find a high-paying job, or unlucky because his earnings were so unstable. The man worked in the office during the day, and in the evenings he worked part-time. He would help unload a truck at the store, or take part in repairs. Louis was left to his own devices all this time. He did not complain. The boy could always occupy himself. Louis liked to draw. He would take pencils or paints, a sheet of paper, and as if he was disconnected from reality. He went away from the gray reality and created whole worlds with bright rainbows, dense forests, and cute creatures with big eyes, the kind you don't meet in real life. Henry didn't worry about his son going hungry. The main thing was to have something in the refrigerator: bread, sausage, eggs, milk, frozen dumplings. Louis was fine with lunch and dinner. He also fed his father, who was tired after work. That's how they lived. Until it turned out that the apartment was going to the bank for debt. At that time, there were overdue mortgages and loans. So they asked the man and his child to vacate the premises. Henry, as a lawyer, tried to fight for his property. He filed for bankruptcy, tried to explain his plight to people. To no avail. In the end, to avoid the attention of the child welfare authorities, he had to accept it. That's how Henry and Louis ended up at the hostel. James immediately made friends with them. He liked the honest, hard-working Henry. He liked Louis, who was so serious and mature for his 6 years. The three of them became buddies, or even friends, and often had dinner together. James occasionally took Louis for walks. Henry worked a lot, and sitting in a dark hostel was boring for the child. So James took Louis for walks. They talked about everything in the world, discussed different situations, told each other something about themselves. James learned that Louis really wants to become an artist. But the little boy realized that to do that, he had to study. Also, Louis knew that his father did not have money and time to take him to circles or to art school. And that made Louis sad. But the kid did not lose heart, thinking that he would go to the first grade, and there would probably be free classes for students. School was just around the corner, less than a year away. If Louis was looking forward to the start of school with joyful anticipation, his father feared the moment. Because then his and Louis' small homeless family was guaranteed to be on the radar of the child welfare authorities. A child should have a home, a workplace, a bed. And little Louis is living in a hostel. Basically, he's wandering around with his homeless father. Of course, no one's going to leave the boy with a loser parent. They'll take him to an orphanage. Henry knew all too well what it was like there. Shelley had told him enough for the man to try his best to avoid the same scenario for his own child. Except he didn't have the strength, and there was no help. Henry was willing to work, to toil at several jobs, which he actually did. But all these efforts did not bring the desired result. It was still a long way from buying his own place. Henry had some savings, but not enough for even a fraction of the down payment. In short, the situation was desperate. James cringed at the icy wind, or at the sudden rush of thoughts, memories. It wasn't a gentle fall, more like winter. The snow would fall. It would become brighter, more beautiful, softer. Little Louise was looking forward to the new year, to receive presents, to sit at the festive table, to make a wish. He's an adult now. Louise is independent. But still a child, still quite a boy, sincerely believed that the wish made under the chimes would come true. And James knew perfectly well what he would ask Santa Claus or someone else for. In fact, he knew exactly what little Louise was wishing for. The boy would ask for an apartment for him and his dad, and an art school for himself. It's just a shame none of those things will come true anytime soon. James is going to get Louis something he'll love. Already picked up a young artist's kit at the store. Expensive, of course, but nothing's too good for Louis. A suitcase, an easel with a set of paints, pencils, and felt-tip pens. The anticipation of Louis's eyes lighting up at the sight of this splendor made James feel warm. It was so nice to please the people around him, and the children twice as much. But this miracle suitcase would not solve the problems of the little boy and his father, only partially brighten up the gray everyday life of the child. At least that's it. James finally climbed from the bridge to the embankment. Now he was walking along the parapet, in a hurry to get to work. There was no way he could be late. Henry valued him, among other things, for his diligence and reliability. He didn't want to let the man down. And then James noticed that people were standing by the lantern. Men and women, teenagers, children. They were talking excitedly, some were making phone calls, some were filming something on their phones. James followed the gazes of these people. He was stunned. He had never expected to see such a thing. In the dark waves of the wide river, 50 meters from the shore, there was something, or rather, someone. A human head emerged from under the water and then disappeared again. This someone was drowning. He had no strength left. There was no time to speculate about how the man had gotten into the river at a time like this. James, not giving himself time to think over the desperate act, had already swung over the parapet. The man sped across the strip of beach, sand packed into his sneakers, rolled up his pants. The man ran to the water's edge, threw off his jacket, sweater, shoes. It's all heavier. In the cold waves of the river, it would be extra ballast. James was an excellent swimmer. The river was very close to his village. As a child, he used to spend days there with the local boys, swimming and diving and just splashing and frolicking. James, at 5 or 6 years old, felt like a fish in water. Such a pun. But of course, the man never went into the river in this weather. Cold wind and a strong current. And he'd never rescued a drowning man before. But James realized that if he didn't try to pull this man out, no one would help him. And then how to live with it. He had to at least try. The man very well imagined now the despair of a drowning man. There are so many people around, but they are all just watching. Someone's calling the rescue team. Will they make it in time? It's a matter of seconds. The icy water burned his feet. James shivered, but stepped forward. He knew it would be cold at first, and then his body would adapt. And so it did. And now the man is already approaching the drowning man with powerful rows. It is hard to swim strong current, wind, and there is a lot of garbage in the water. Some branches, snags, tina, elderly fangs of algae. James had less and less strength, but he could see his goal. A head of dark hair, he was close enough to get a good look at the person. It appeared to be a young girl, or even a child. Pale face, eyes black with despair and horror. The drowning woman was struggling for life with her last strength. She must have been a good swimmer, or she would have gone under long ago. But in any case, if James didn't hurry, she would. Finally, the man was close by. He swam up behind the girl. A needed knowledge rose from somewhere from the depths of memory. Drowning people in a desperate attempt to survive are even capable of drowning their saviors. That's why James kept his distance. Good thing the girl had long hair. James grabbed hold of it and swam to the shore. The girl felt help coming. At first, she wanted to reach for James to claw at him, but he wouldn't let go. Then the girl sort of realized what was happening, even relaxed a little and let herself be pulled out. Yeah, she wasn't going to be able to handle the current alone. The girl seemed very thin, almost transparent. Already on the shore, silently looking into the face of her rescuer, the poor girl lost consciousness. Here they were already waiting. Someone wrapped James in a plaid. Someone else covered the girl. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance. The man looked around and realized Everything was going to be okay now. Only then his hands trembled, and for some reason his teeth chattered. Whether it was the cold or the fear, James had almost lost the girl, and he might not have made it out at this water temperature. The focus of everyone's attention shifted to the girl. The doctors arrived, and from somewhere came an anxious tall man dressed in an expensive leather jacket. It seemed to be the girl's father. At least they both had the same hazel-colored eyes, dark blonde hair, large nose, and defined cheekbones. James didn't wait for the story to unfold. He dressed quickly and hurried to Henry's office. Surely the boss would accept his tardiness when James told him the reason. But Henry was late that day, so he didn't even have to explain himself. James was hurrying to the store to buy milk, and the next morning, when a man called out to him, he turned around slowly and met his gaze with the familiar hazel eyes. In front of him was a man in a stylish leather jacket. The girl's father, who had somehow ended up in the water that day. "I finally found you," the man smiled, holding out his hand to James. "It wasn't easy. My name is Bob. I'm the father of the teenager you rescued." "Hello," James muttered. He knew the man wanted to thank him. James was anxious to know what had happened to the girl, what her condition was now, how she had gotten into the water. All these days the man thought a lot about the rescued girl. "I wanted to believe that she was okay." Thanks to social media, the man continued. One of the people who were on the embankment at the time posted a video. "This video clearly shows you saving my Tara. A brave thing to do. Desperate. There aren't many people like you these days. And how lucky you were there when you did." "How's the girl?" James asked. "Thera's fine. She's in rehab right now," Bob said. "So she's physically hurt?" "Not really. Just a little cold. That's the other thing. Do you know how she ended up in the river? Did you see that moment?" James shook his head no. All because of unrequited love. She fell in love with some boy, and he started dating someone else. Tara got herself worked up, that's all. She's in counseling now. She's under observation, and she's on the mend. In fact, as it turns out, she realized right away what a stupid thing she'd done. Right after she got in the icy water. It was too late if it hadn't been for you. "The important thing is that everything's okay now," James smiled. "That's true. Her impulse was accidental. I think this situation taught your girl a lot. It taught me a lot," Bob admitted. "For years in business, I thought there were no good, selfless people who would do what you do. I became cynical, cold, callous. Your act taught me a lot and made me rethink all my values. I've changed a lot." James nodded. "What can I say? I want to thank you. I have opportunities. I know you live in a hostel. You don't have your own place. Ask for anything you want, anything at all. People like you deserve a better fate." James thought for a moment. He remembered Henry's worried eyes when he received his notice from the guardianship authorities, and he remembered little Louis talking excitedly about his dream of becoming an artist. "My life suits me just fine," James said at last. "But there is one person, a little person, who could use your help." He smiled and spread his arms out to catch the boy, hugging him as he liked. "I won first place in the town drawing contest with my drawing of space. Remember I showed it to you?" "Of course I remember." "I told you this would happen," Henry answered. They agreed to go for a walk in the park that Sunday afternoon. Louis liked to run along the paved paths, feed the ducks in the pond, and watch the funny girls. And James and Henry liked to sit at the local cafe, where they cooked flavorful, melt-in-your-mouth kebabs. A little over a year had passed since that conversation with Bob. The wealthy businessman had been amazed at James's request. After all, he had not asked for himself but wanted to help his friend with a small child, two people in desperate straits. Bob bought Henry a one-room apartment, but in a new building in a good neighborhood, near the gymnasium and, importantly, the art school. Henry enrolled Louis in it at the first opportunity. From then on, the boy's talent developed rapidly. His drawings became more and more professional and correct, but at the same time did not lose their uniqueness and spontaneity. Of course, Bob could not help but do something for James personally, although he did not ask him to do so. First, the businessman bought an apartment next to Henry and Louis. They became neighbors, not hostile tenants. Secondly, Bob gave his daughter's savior a high-paying job as a gardener. James had always enjoyed tinkering in the ground, tending to the plants. This was where he belonged. Tara, Bob's daughter, shunned the new gardener for some reason. She was probably afraid of the memories of him. But then they became friends. The girl, as it turned out, regretted her action and now, after a while, could not explain even to herself how she had dared to do such a thing. Sometimes James looked at the tall, thin, touching Tara, and his heart sank at the thought of what would have happened if he hadn't pulled her out of the water. Henry and James walked slowly down the parkway. Ahead of them on his scooter rolled a happy Lewis. "Oh, there you are. I thought you were waiting for me at the fountain." James turned around, smiled, and hurried toward Olivia, a short woman with piercing blue eyes. They had only met recently, but it was already clear that they were serious. Today they'd agreed to go out for a fun, boisterous group of people. It was going to be a wonderful day. Two women were returning from the store with heavy bags. They lived in the neighborhood, and it was a long walk from the store. But that didn't upset the neighbors, who were known in town as Mrs. Jessica and Mrs. Carolyn. They had much to discuss. Mrs. Jessica began her story. Well, she came back at 3 o'clock in the morning. Stephen brought her back and picked up his granddaughter from the hospital on the way. Mrs. Caroline gasped. What kind of baby did she have? The third or the fourth? Carolyn, don't distract me. You're distracting me. Are you interested or not? Mrs. Jessica asked. Let me finish. Anyway, Stephen brought her in at 3 in the morning with her newborn granddaughter. And she has a belly, the granddaughter. Come on. Did the granddaughter give birth on her own? Her belly, did she give birth? Yes, Carolyn. Mrs. Jessica exclaimed in delight. The news was out of the blue. The whole town knew the Zivanarov family. However, they did not have many residents, and everyone knew everyone. But the daughter was something of a local celebrity. At last her grandmother will stop being so uppity, said Mrs. Caroline gloatingly. She's been playing the blue-blooded girl for years. She's lived here for years, and when you look at her, you can tell she's from the city. Mrs. Jessica laughed. You don't say. She's been walking around town all her life, sticking her nose up, like she's better than us, and she's got a granddaughter herself. Didn't she leave to go to college, to study veterinary medicine? So we learned. The neighbors laughed again. Who's the father, Mrs. Carolyn asked. Mrs. Jessica waved her hand. Look for the wind in the field. What a thing to do. By the time they reached their homes, the fresh gossip had been discussed on all sides. But the women already knew that as soon as they got home and put the groceries they had bought on the refrigerator shelves, they would each pick up their cell phones and start calling everyone they knew. So soon the whole town would know about it. Jessica has loved animals since she was 5 years old. She found a sparrow with a broken wing in the street. Probably one of the local boys had hit it with a slingshot. But the bird managed to fly away from its offender and get to the lilac bushes under which the girl was playing. Jessica brought the sparrow to her grandmother. What do you have there, Jessica? Melissa asked. Instead of answering, the granddaughter held out her hands. The sparrow. Let's have a look. Grandma picked up the injured bird and carried it to her desk. She laid down an old, clean white towel, put on her glasses, and scrutinized the sparrow. Jessica had been quietly following Melissa the whole time. She knew her grandmother wouldn't send her away, but she didn't want to disturb her. Aren't you afraid? Melissa asked. No, Jessica answered boldly. Her grandmother looked at her fondly. Huge blue eyes, black hair braided into 2 pigtails. She looks just like her mother at that age, Melissa thought. She said nothing aloud, but smiled. Look, she said to her granddaughter, I'm going to take a look at him. You have to be careful. I will touch it very gently with my fingertips. See? Yes, Grandma. Oh. His head, torso, and legs are intact. The left wing is intact, but the right wing is bruised. Will you fix him, Grandma? I'll do my best, honey. We'll have to fix the wing so it'll reattach. And we've got to get this poor bastard into a warm, dry place, fed and watered. You'll help me take care of him, won't you? Yes, Grandma. Jessica was happy. They got that sparrow out, as well as many other animals after it. Melissa had been a veterinarian all her life. Not in this town, though. She came here 5 years ago with little Jessica in her arms. Before that, Melissa had lived in the big city, where she ran the largest veterinary clinic for many years. She was the most well-known and sought-after specialist. So much in demand that she had no time at all to raise her own daughter. With her husband, Melissa divorced when James was only 10 years old. The husband simply could not withstand the presence of such a strong and intelligent woman. But Melissa did not care. She was all about work. And when she realized that James had grown up, it was too late. Her son had already gotten mixed up with bad company. He was hardly ever home and was dating Ricky the musician, who was 10 years older than him. When Melissa found out, James was already expecting a baby. "Are you going to have a baby? You're going to have a baby?" His mother yelled at him. "Yes, Ricky loves me. This baby came out of love, unlike how you and Daddy had me." Melissa gasped in indignation. "You're just a kid yourself. Where will you live and what will you live on? He's a penniless musician. He's talented. It's just that you don't know anything but your horses and dogs. We can manage without you." "Great. Go to your musician and go." That day, James packed up and moved out of his mother's house. And a few months later, Melissa was awakened by an early doorbell. On the doorstep lay a baby wrapped in several blankets and a note: "You were right. I'm too young to be a father, and going on tour with an infant is inconvenient. If you don't want to raise him, give him to an orphanage. I don't care." When Melissa read that, it was as if something inside her broke. Over the next week, she quit her job, sold her city apartment, and bought a house in a remote village. She figured she had enough savings for the rest of her life. Melissa was determined not to make the same mistake a second time. She would raise her grandson in love and understanding. He would grow up to be a good boy, kind, gentle, affectionate. He will not throw himself at the first musician he meets, because he lacks love from people close to him. Melissa will do anything to replace his father and mother. "I want to be a veterinarian too, just like you," Grandma Lillian declared when she turned 10. Melissa smiled. "Of course, I'm very glad you want to follow in my footsteps. But there are so many exciting new professions in the world. You don't have to be a veterinarian. You can become anything you want: a teacher, an astronaut, an actress." The granddaughter shook her head. "I love animals, and I love it when they get well." Grandma thought for a moment. "Good. I'll try to teach you everything I know. But when you grow up and finish school, you will still have to go to the city, enter the university and study there for a few years." The girl listened to her attentively. "Okay, Grandma," she said with a seriousness unusual for a 10-year-old child. "I will study with you and then at the university." Melissa smiled and nodded. From that day on, she began to make contacts with the villagers. Previously, she only interacted with people out of necessity, when she needed to buy milk, eggs, cottage cheese, meat, and other necessary food and non-food items. However, when the former head of the city's main veterinary clinic realized that she would have to teach her granddaughter the ins and outs of her beloved profession, she seriously reconsidered her attitude. It became apparent to Melissa that a lot of hands-on training would be required. Just the occasional sparrow and frog won't do it, she thought. It started with a trip to the local store. Normally, the woman would try to get her shopping done quickly and go home. But this time, Melissa lingered. "I've had bitter milk for 2 weeks. Can you believe it?" She heard Paul at the counter. "Yeah. Oh, that's too bad. We've always bought from you. It was the best." "You don't say. We don't know what to do with it, even if we cut it up. But it's a pity. She's a young cow, not even 5 years old." "Did you by any chance change the place where she was grazing in recent weeks?" The women stopped talking and stared at Melissa. In 10 years, they'd grown accustomed to the strange newcomer. Although she had lived in an old house on the edge of the village for a long time, she had never done anything bad. They still called her Townie behind her eyes. Her big eyes. Lillian's granddaughter went to school with the other children and was no different from them. But her grandmother Melissa always showed that she was different. She never said hello to anyone, never talked to anyone. She never invited anyone to visit her. That's why the day when she suddenly spoke to the locals herself went down in the history of the village. Yes, said the landlady, when she had recovered from her surprise. She ate all the grass in her usual place. And my son Paul found a new field. Melissa nodded. Take me there. Oh. The landlady looked at her questioningly. I rode my motorcycle here. It has a sidecar. If you're not afraid, I'll take you. Great. When they got to the field, Melissa got off the bike and looked at the ground. Here, she said triumphantly, clutching a blade of grass in her hand. This is the cause of your cow's bitter milk. It's not the most common plant in these parts, but there's quite a lot of it in this clearing. Let your son Paul graze the cow elsewhere, and after a while her milk will be as sweet as before. News of Melissa's talent spread through the village in a matter of hours. The very next day, people came to see her about her sick horse. Then she was called to a neighbor whose chickens had suddenly stopped laying. Then she was asked to find out why a 6-month-old piglet had suddenly stopped gaining weight. And everywhere Melissa took her granddaughter Lillian. Strangely, but the little fragile girl was not frightened by the huge animals, nor by what her grandmother sometimes had to do with them. Yeah, toughness of spirit. You're like me, Melissa said once when her granddaughter helped her deliver a cow. Lillian looked at her in surprise. We're helping animals, Grandma, Melissa said. That's right. Lillian's education was a success. When the girl turned 15, Melissa started sending her alone for simple cases. When she realized that Lillian was doing well, she began entrusting her with more difficult tasks. Everyone in the village already knew that the girl would finish school and go to the city to study veterinary medicine. You'll come back to us later, won't you? Aunt Caroline once asked Lillian. The girl shrugged her shoulders. I guess I like it here. You should find a good husband, Aunt Caroline said thoughtfully. Lillian blushed. It was too early to think about that. The woman waved her hand. It's never too early to think about it. Stephen's granddaughter has had her second, and she's only 3 years older than you. I mean, look at my youngest, Ryan. He's a hell of a guy. Lillian didn't bother to say that he was famous for his promiscuity and even more for his bragging. I'm just thinking about school for now, she said firmly. Well, you're just like your grandmother, sighed Aunt Caroline. Stephen's been trying to hit on her for 2 years now, and she's still not getting it. They're such a loving family. Lillian thought, but didn't say anything out loud. Even though both Melissa and her daughter were respected in the village, they were still not considered completely their own. The good vets help everyone, but they keep to themselves. Melissa doesn't like to receive guests, and Lillian is unapproachable to the village boys. So what if she's a pretty girl? No, she's a pretty girl, of course fragile as a reed. Big blue eyes, long black hair, thick fluffy eyelashes. But is it really worth it to play hard to get? Lillian walked to the store. Of course, it wasn't healthy to carry heavy things when you were 9 months pregnant, but they were almost out of food at home. And Grandma hadn't been feeling well lately. Age was taking its toll, after all. Of course, Lillian noticed how curious the villagers looked at her. The way the women smiled wryly when Lillian entered the store. They whispered as if she couldn't hear anything. Lillian didn't react in any way. A loaf of white bread, please, she said to Aunt Patricia, the perky little clerk who had worked in the store as long as Lillian could remember. Is she pregnant? Said Aunt Patricia. What else? A pack of matches, a pack of butter, macaroni and oatmeal cookies. I'll be right there, baby. How are you doing? Baby? Aunt Carolyn's voice came from behind Lillian. I'm fine, Lillian answered calmly. How's school? The woman's voice was clearly sarcastic. I'm a correspondence student. It's fine, Lillian replied calmly. Oh yeah, who's the father? Daughter. Aunt Jessica couldn't take it anymore, she said. Thank you, Aunt Patricia, goodbye. Lillian handed over the money, took her shopping and left. She didn't dignify Aunt Jessica with an answer. What kind of girl doesn't want to come clean? playing the innocent. We all know she's promiscuous, Aunt Carolyn said at her. Aunt Jessica shrugged her shoulders. What about me? Has everyone seen her? Where's the husband? No husband. So she's out. As she left the store, Lillian wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. It's all right, she'll get over it. The stares, the conversations, the questions, not the worst of it. She could take it all. The main thing is that Grandma Melissa is on her side. Lillian got into veterinary school without any problems. She and her grandmother decided in advance that the girl would study at the correspondence department. But only for a year longer, Melissa said. You'll get the same diploma. And we need it for work. You learn the theory on your own, and I taught you everything I know. Of course, it's understandable that after all these years, a lot of new things have come up. But that's okay. If you know the basics, you'll figure it out quickly. Lillian smiled at her grandmother. You always say the most important thing is practice. Melissa nodded. And you've had plenty of it. And to make it even more, I asked one of my former subordinates to hire you at his clinic. Will you help a young but very talented doctor there and study in your spare time? Grandma asked. Okay, Grandma Lillian replied. Studying came easily to her. Of course, a lot had changed since Grandma had been in charge of the clinic. Veterinary science had advanced a lot, but it was still much easier for Lillian than her classmates who didn't have the same experience. Peter, her grandmother's former apprentice and subordinate, and now the director of the clinic himself, welcomed Lillian with open arms. Hello, hello, daughter. He shook her hand affectionately and invited her to sit down. In the pictures her grandmother had shown her, Peter had been a thin, short guy with funny round glasses. Now he was wide, had laser vision correction, and had grown a thick, dark red beard. How's Melissa? He asked. We were all shocked when she suddenly announced that she was quitting her position as head of the hospital and resigning. Lillian knew why her grandmother had suddenly resigned from such an important position, but she would hardly be happy if her granddaughter talked about their personal life. It's all right, Lillian said. She asked me to give you her regards and said she was very proud of you. Peter smiled embarrassedly and for a few seconds looked like the young man in the photo from 20 years ago. Thank you. That's very nice to hear, he said. I take it Melissa still prioritizes hands-on learning? Lillian smiled. That's why I enrolled as a part-time student. That's actually a wise decision, Peter said. Well, will you be working as an assistant to one of our doctors? I'm sure he'll teach you a lot. The doctor was only 8 years older than Lillian. However, the girl immediately noticed that he was respected by the rest of the clinic staff, and she liked Nicholas at first sight. Tall, blonde-haired, with blue eyes, he seemed to always be in a good mood and showed kindness to both people and animals. He took the news that he would now have a new assistant quite calmly. Well, Jessica? He said cheerfully. We'll see how you do in the field. I'll do my best, Lillian replied. Working with Nicholas was interesting. He had an easy rapport with both the animals and their owners. Lillian noticed how carefully he took a history, how detailed his examination was. It's easier with sick people, he explained to Lillian. They can tell you everything in words, but with animals we can only focus on what the owners notice. Not all of them are very observant, so you should help them to ask how the animal's behavior and habits have changed. And of course, the examination of the pet itself gives a lot. Lillian listened attentively and nodded. By the way, you are very good at manipulation, Nicholas praised her. Injections, bandages, and everything else. Where'd you learn that? My grandmother is a veterinarian, Lillian answered. She used to take me with her whenever someone in the village asked her to help. Oh, you have more experience than me, exclaimed the doctor cheerfully. Lillian smiled embarrassedly. I've been observing more only for the last 3 years. She began to trust me. Various uncomplicated cases. And in the village our patients were mostly cows, horses, pigs, chickens, goats, dogs, and cats too, but much rarer. Well said, Nicholas. We rarely have cows and chickens, but your experience is excellent. I can see that you are good at what you do. Just study hard, do well in your exams. I'll teach you the rest. He gave her a list of current textbooks and websites. That's what you have to read. Not to the fact that half of what you'll learn at the Institute is already outdated, and another quarter will be outdated by the time you get your diploma. That's sad, Lillian said. The doctor shrugged. That's life. By the way, if you want, I can give you another part-time job. It is in our clinic you will perform manipulations for animals whose owners agree to bring them to us every day. Which, for example, to put IVs, shots, many do it themselves, said Nicholas. And I understand that. After all, everyone's budget is different. In this case, your task is to explain to the owner in as much detail as possible how to do it safely, painlessly, and effectively for the pet. Understood? Lillian nodded. But some owners are willing to pay for comfort and safety and trust their pet only to us. Sort of like a daycare center. There's a nurse shortage in the evening. Thank you, the girl replied. I would love to take this part-time job. Most of the people who came to the day hospital were IVs. Lillian quickly learned to find the veins and carefully placed the catheter. The owners of the animals were very satisfied. Lillian even almost became friends with one of the owners. Tara was a sweet little woman of about 36. It was immediately obvious that she was a very wealthy woman, expensive brand-name clothes, well-groomed, manicured face and nails, small purses that changed every time she visited. She had a long red cat named Puppeteer, who was dear to the mistress and her husband, about whom she constantly said. Alex and I have been married for 13 years, she told Lillian, stroking the cat as he lay under the IV and showing her how much he disliked this pastime. We got him the first week after we got back from our wedding trip. We came out of the store and he was sitting on the porch hungry. Small, scared. Now he looked as well-fed and well-groomed as possible, with a long, silky coat. And he's been with us ever since, Tara continued. He's like a child to us. Lillian nodded. When she had lived in the countryside, she had been used to a very different way of treating animals. Yes, the owners loved their pets, but they were more practical. If cows got sick, it potentially threatened the family with the lack of milk, cottage cheese, sour cream, and meat that the cow was once supposed to go to. Horses were needed for transporting goods, cats for catching mice. Dogs guarded the house. Chickens laid eggs. And here in the city, animals had little practical use, but were treated almost like members of their family. At first, Lillian didn't understand it, although she loved animals herself. But gradually, talking to the owners, she realized that behind each cat, dog, parrot, there was a personal story. Kuklavad the cat was very seriously ill. He had to go on drips for 3 weeks. And since the cat was not easy, Lillian tried not to go far away during the IVs. So she got to know Tyr and her family more and more. He is like a child to us, the owner of the ginger cat often repeated. And one day she decided to explain to the girl in detail. My husband and I have wanted to have a child for a long time, she confessed. We have been trying for almost 10 years, but it still doesn't work out. I'm very sorry for you, Lillian said. But you can still do it. Don't worry, you're so young. Tara suddenly shrieked. No, she shouted almost desperately. We've tried so many times. We've been tested from head to toe dozens of times. I've done IVF 7 times. Nothing works. She cried. Lillian was confused. She didn't expect that the treatment of the cat would turn into such a serious topic. But then the girl did realize and brought the puppeteer's mistress some paper napkins. Thank you, exclaimed Tara, blowing her nose loudly. And that rascal is so sick. He scared us. The cat didn't even flinch. Apparently, he was used to his mistress's mood swings. Don't worry, said Lillian. The puppeteer will be all right. And so will you. Tara sobbed a few more times, but then finally calmed down. Thank you, daughter, she said. You're a very good girl. I just feel better every time I come home from you. Lillian smiled. You're very nice too. Thank you. Tara blotted her eyes once more with her napkin and suddenly asked, Why did you decide to become a veterinarian? Lillian smiled. Because of my grandmother. She ran this clinic many years ago, Lillian continued. Wow. Yes, Tara nodded. And then it happened that she had to raise me from infancy. So she gave up her position, bought a house in the country and moved there with me. That's how we lived our whole lives. I liked to help animals from childhood. My grandmother taught me everything she knew. Now I have to continue my education, get my diploma, and run a clinic too. Tara was already smiling. Lillian smiled back. Well, maybe in many years, she replied. Where is your grandmother now? Lillian sighed. She lives alone in the village for now. But someday I'll bring her to live with me. I'll buy us a small, beautiful, and comfortable house in the city, and we'll live there. Tara nodded thoughtfully. I'm sure, Lillian, she said, that everything will work out. What do you do in your spare time? Nicholas once asked his assistant. Lillian was just finishing filling out the cards for today's four-legged patients. What time is it? She asked. The doctor laughed. I get the hint. I think I've gotten you too busy. Lillian frowned. I don't like hints. My grandmother always taught me to be blunt about everything. Well, that's good, Nicholas replied cautiously, not understanding where she was going with this. I'm satisfied with the amount of work I have now, Lillian explained. I sit with you at the reception in the morning, and in the evening I earn practical skills. In between, I try to study. I don't have a lot of free time. The doctor nodded. I understood that. But maybe you, Lillian, do have some free time sometimes, don't you? He looked pitifully at the girl with his expressive brown eyes. She sighed. Yes, I have this Saturday off, but I wanted to see my grandmother. I haven't seen her in 3 months and she wanted to come to town. I need to get some medicine for the animals. She still works as a veterinarian for you, unofficially, Lillian replied. There's just no one else in the village to do it. I understand, Nicholas nodded. An interesting idea suddenly occurred to him. If you want, I could introduce you, Lillian said. Nicholas hummed in surprise. That's an unexpected offer. But if my presence won't make you uncomfortable, I'll accept it. Good, Lillian said. Then it's a deal. At first, the grandmother was skeptical about meeting her granddaughter's boss. But after chatting with Nicholas for about half an hour, Lillian noticed her grandmother's face soften. It's nice to know how far science has come since the last time I worked, Melissa said. I thought in so many years I'd make my granddaughter an almost ready veterinarian. Turns out she has to start from scratch. Nicholas smiled and shook his head. Melissa, you've done a wonderful job of preparation. Believe me, if I had a grandmother like you, I'd be running a clinic today. Still, the basics of anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, disease pathology, and many other processes have not changed over time. You've also given Lillian a tremendous practical background. Melissa nodded favorably. Of course, she was pleased to hear that. She looked at her granddaughter with a smile, who smiled back at her. Well, Lillian's experience in the village is pretty specific, she said. When I first came there after practicing in a city clinic for so many years, I had a hard time too. Don't you want to go back to the city? Nicholas asked suddenly. It must be hard for you in the village alone right now, isn't it? Melissa shrugged. I've gotten used to it over the years, and she's not as old and helpless as she looks at first glance. At least the local grandfathers still come to me to ask me to marry them. Lillian laughed. That's a lot of wow, Grandma. Melissa shrugged and stood up. All right, you young people, have fun, she said. I've got a bus to catch. Are you upset? Lillian asked. I don't want to. It's too late to go back, said Grandma. But it's getting dark early. I'll take you to the train station, Nicholas offered. After they had seen the grandmother off, the doctor asked, Do you want me to drive you home, or can we walk some more? Lillian rubbed her eyes sleepily. I'm going home. I'm tired and I want to sleep. Don't be offended. He smiled. I'm not offended. It was nice to meet your grandmother. She really is a great woman. Lillian smiled. She really liked you too. After 3 weeks, the course of IVs ended. Nicholas examined him, carefully read the results of control tests, and announced to the owners that the cat is perfectly healthy. "Of course he is no longer a boy," said the doctor, "but for his age is holding up very well. Diet I wrote you. If anything, you know our address." "Thank you very much," Nicholas said, Tara's husband. A nice, quiet man in a business suit. On Christopher's lap lay a caged treasure, which he held gently with one hand, and with the other hand he tenderly squeezed his wife's palm. Lillian suddenly turned to the girl. "I have a favor to ask of you. Could you leave me your phone number? If you don't want to, I'll understand." Lillian looked at the doctor in surprise, but replied, "Okay, I'll text you now." Tara called her that same evening. "Lillian, I told my husband about how you took care of our kitty, and he wants to thank you." "No, you don't have to," Lillian replied, embarrassed. "I was just doing my job." "And you helped me a lot," said the cat's owner. "So please don't say no. We just want to invite you to dinner." Lillian thought that perhaps that was something she could agree to. "Okay," the girl replied. "Where do I have to go?" "What are you talking about?" Tara exclaimed. "Our driver will pick you up. You don't have to worry so much. Believe me, it's not hard for us. Especially since we live in the countryside, it's impossible to get there any other way." "Good," Lillian agreed. Of course, she was a little worried, especially when she got into the luxurious black car with tinted windows. "Hello," Lillian said timidly to the driver, a huge, pumped-up man in a black suit, who opened the door for her and helped her to get in. The man nodded without changing his expression. Why did they need this dinner, Lillian thought. A simple thank you would have sufficed. Especially since they gave me a huge fruit basket, which I shared with the entire clinic that same day. Nicholas got an expensive whiskey. "I won't be as generous as Lillian and keep it," the doctor stated. "Just kidding. We'll open it at the New Year's Eve party." His co-workers were outraged, but Nicholas was adamant. Where here the driver's voice sounded, breaking Lillian out of her thoughts. The man got out quickly, opened the door, and gave her his hand. The girl thanked him embarrassedly. "Shall I go in there?" Lillian asked timidly, as they stopped in front of the high marble porch of a magnificent mansion. "I'll show you out." As they walked along, Lillian was surprised to think that she hadn't realized how rich the owners were. The cat knew it was clear they had money. Surely she knew how much it cost for 3 weeks of IVs to save a cat from a serious illness. But that car, the driver, the country mansion behind the high fence. "Lillian, are you here?" Tara happily ran up to her and hugged her as if they were old friends, despite the posh surroundings. The woman kept herself very simple, which made Lillian like her even more. Christopher was here, too, only he kept a more reserved demeanor than his wife. He smiled at Lillian and nodded. "Let's go to the dining room," he said, as his wife opened her arms. Yes, of course," Tara answered him. The three of them walked into the huge dining room. Lillian looked at the long table with a white lace tablecloth, filled with many dishes of food. She felt uneasy. She turned to the owners of the house and said timidly, "I'm sorry in advance, but I don't know anything about cutlery." Christopher shrugged. "What's there to know? You eat liquids with a spoon and solids with a fork. And if you mean those houses where they serve 10 kinds of cutlery for every meal, that's not us." "We're simple people," Christopher said, putting his arm around his wife and kissing her gently on the temple. She smiled softly and invited Lillian to the table. After a few minutes, the girl was completely relaxed. In their company, it seemed as if she was sitting with old pals. The couple talked about the cat. "We decided to buy him a new scratching post," Tara said. "The old one is already scary to look at. Seva and I spent a week choosing one. And this bully began to tear it the first night. I had to return the old one." Lillian smiled. There was a pause, and the girl noticed how the couple suddenly looked at each other. They clearly wanted to say something else, but it was as if they were working up the courage. Finally, Tara, squeezing her husband's hand, turned to Lillian. "If we're being honest, we didn't call you here just to thank you for saving our favorite cat. Of course, that too. But our main purpose was different. Lillian froze. "I'm listening to you," she said. Tara took a deep breath, and in one breath she blurted out, "We're asking you to be a surrogate mom for our baby." Oh, was all Lillian could say. This is all very unexpected. Christopher entered the conversation. "We realize that this is a very unexpected offer, but please don't be in a hurry to refuse." "Yes, we've given it a lot of thought," Tara said, "and please at least hear us out." They looked at Lillian with such a pleading look that she realized she couldn't refuse the request. "I told you that we've been trying for years to have a child," Tara began, "but all those attempts were unsuccessful." Her voice trembled, and her husband put his arm around her shoulders. "The doctors said we're both healthy, except that my body can't carry a baby, so surrogacy is my only chance." "But why did you choose me?" Lillian couldn't take it anymore. "You hardly know me." Tara shook her head desperately. "No, I've spent enough time with you to know what kind of person you are." "You're a very nice girl," Tara said. "Most importantly, I trust you completely. That's probably the most important criteria for us." Christopher nodded. There's probably something I should explain. I'm a fairly public person who is involved in business, in politics. Unfortunately, we are still condemning this way of having children. So it's important for us that no one knows about it. And I trust you completely," Tara repeated. "But pregnancy was not part of my plans," Lillian said. "I have work, school." The couple nodded. "You can continue that for the first few months of your pregnancy," Christopher replied. "And then you can take a sabbatical. You don't have to be on maternity leave, so you don't have to miss much. And since you're a part-time student, you might not have to miss anything. And we'll reimburse you for missed work days," of course, Tara added. "In fact, all expenses will be on us. Doctor's exams, food, clothing, vitamins, trips to the hospital, and so on. But you'll also receive a substantial financial compensation." "You told me you wanted to buy a house near the city to live with your grandmother," Tara interjected. "If necessary, my husband and I can help you find the house of your dreams, with full renovations, furnishings, and furniture, and a convenient commute to the city for you and your grandmother." Lillian sighed. She'd been thinking about this for a long time. Her grandmother, though still vigorous, was not as strong and sturdy as she used to be. Lillian herself was not going to stay in the village, and it was unlikely that her veterinarian's salary would allow her to quickly save up for an apartment where she and her grandmother could live. "Please think about it," Tara took her hand gently. "You're our only hope. It won't be for long." "I don't know," Lillian sighed. "This is all very sudden." Tara nodded. Suddenly, tears welled up in her eyes, but she tried to hold them back. "Sorry, I'll step back," she said, and walked out of the dining room. Christopher stood up. "We don't want to pressure you," he said. "Just think it over at your leisure. In the meantime, my driver will take you back, and please don't tell anyone about our offer." "Of course," Lillian replied. She kept her word and did not tell about this conversation neither to Nicholas, with whom they had dinner after work, nor to her grandmother, to whom she went to celebrate New Year's holidays. "How are you here without me?" she asked Melissa. "I'm getting by," she said. "Of course it can be difficult, especially in winter. You know, without central heating, water supply, and a warm toilet, it's not very cozy here." Melissa noticed the upset look on her granddaughter's face and immediately corrected herself. "But that doesn't mean I'm complaining. I'm still able to take care of myself. Don't worry." "You never complain," Lillian sighed, noticing, as did her grandmother. After spending a few days with her grandmother, Lillian finally decided that she would accept the surrogacy offer. How much longer will Grandma be able to support herself? What if she falls while carrying water from the well, breaks a leg, or catches a cold and gets sick? And in general, carrying heavy things at her age is not very healthy. "I agree," Lillian said as she called Tara. "Lillian, really?" "Yes. Oh, my girl. This is the best present my husband and I could have gotten. When can we see you?" The same taciturn driver took her to a familiar house. There, Lillian and the couple discussed the terms of the contract in detail. Most importantly, you must keep it a secret, Christopher said seriously. I absolutely insist that this condition be fulfilled, even if it concerns friends, lovers, and relatives. Lillian nodded. Okay, I won't tell anyone. As we said, we'll cover all expenses, Christopher continued. But you will be required to undergo certain tests, eat a healthy diet, get plenty of rest, and get at least 8 hours of sleep. Like a vacation in a sanatorium? Tara smiled. Only we'll pay you for it. Sounds great, Lillian smiled. You'll also have a personal assistant, Christopher said. His name is Henry, Christopher said. He will drive you to the hospital, help you with shopping, and so on. Is that necessary? Lillian asked. You can call on Henry as needed, said Tara. You may not need it very often in the first few months. But believe me, it's going to get harder as you go along. And there's no reason to suffer when there's someone to help you. Okay, Lillian replied. It took several months for a full examination, after which the doctors said that Lillian was perfectly healthy and could become a surrogate mother. They succeeded on their first try. Oh, I'm so happy, Tara exclaimed, literally crying with joy. She hugged the girl and kissed her cheeks, flooding her with tears. Christopher, as always, was more reserved, but Lillian could see that he was happy too. It was our destiny to meet you, Tara said with conviction. It's scary to say this, but I consider it a sign of fate that my husband got sick and it brought us to your clinic. Ryan meowed loudly when he heard his name and jumped onto Lillian's lap. He had grown accustomed to her during his visits and now considered her a member of the family. That's a sign, Tara nodded with conviction. Lillian was glad that everything had happened so quickly. The first few months of her pregnancy had been easy, and she had only occasionally used Henry's services. You get used to a good thing, she said as she got into his car after work. What's on the schedule for today? Ultrasound, eye doctor, dentist, and neurologist, he said as he turned the key in the ignition. Also, according to my calculations, you're running low on some vitamins, and we haven't been grocery shopping for a week. Lillian smiled. How do you remember all this? Henry shrugged. It's my job, Lillian. Especially compared to my other clients, you're using me 10% of the time. So your job is escorting surrogate mothers? Lillian wondered. Henry smiled for the first time in a while. My duties are a little broader than that. I just work as a personal assistant. It's interesting work, but most of the time I'm on my feet or in the car all day, Henry said. Do you have to drive around town a lot? Vanessa asked. He nodded. Tell me something interesting about your job, Vanessa asked. We still have a long drive ahead of us. Henry thought for a moment. I worked with a woman once. She made clothes to order, but not plain clothes, but themed ones, like Chinese princess dresses from the 15th century, or an elf archer costume, or something like that. How interesting, Vanessa exclaimed. Yes, and then we had to go to some woodworkers who made bows and arrows, then to a blacksmith, then to some handmade embroidery. Vanessa smiled. Well, I'm not so much fun to be with. You're nice and calm and very polite. I've worked with surrogate mothers a couple times, Henry said. Believe me, they made the most of that time. They'd call me at all hours of the day and night for anything. I'm so sorry for your loss, Lillian laughed. The examinations and tests showed that Lillian and the baby were doing well. The only thing that bothered her was the slowly but surely growing belly. She didn't know what she was going to say to Nicholas, because their communication already seemed to be going beyond the boundaries of boss-subordinate communication. Lillian actually liked Nicholas very much. At first, he tried not to show these feelings. After all, she was much younger than him. And besides, she is his subordinate. After all, who is she? Nicholas tried to convince himself. Just another young, stupid girl who was hired by an acquaintance. It only took him a couple of weeks, however, to be convinced otherwise. Lillian was good with animals, had excellent theoretical and practical training, always came to work on time, filled out paperwork accurately, and listened attentively to everything he said. She was cheerful, polite, and open. Nicholas realized that it had been a long time since he had met such a pleasant person. He decided that he would try to make friends with her. No one forbade him to do that. Nicholas also liked Melissa. It became clear how Lillian had such an upbringing and strong character. And then Lillian agreed to go out to dinner with him after work. And after that evening, Nicholas realized he was in love. He decided not to hurry. To confess his feelings, he did not want to frighten Lillian. Let everything go as it was going. He would be impeccably polite and professional with her at work. And when they had a chance to meet, he would begin to gradually, step by step, reduce the distance until Lillian is ready. And things seemed to be going well for him. Nicholas could see that she liked him too. Lillian laughed at his jokes. They'd hold hands when they went for walks. And then all of a sudden, things started to change. No, Lillian still looked at him with the same tenderness as before, didn't avoid him at work. She seemed to be just as open with him, except that Nicholas could see and feel that she was hiding something from him. Lillian had some business of her own that she didn't tell him anything about. A couple of times he noticed her being picked up from work by some young guy in the same car. Nicholas knew for a fact that Lillian had no brothers or friends here, so he was tormented with jealousy. I realized she doesn't owe me anything, he thought. I haven't even confessed my feelings to her, but I think it's clear enough. And if she has someone else, why won't she tell me? A couple of times he even tried to strike up a conversation with Lillian, asking if she had someone. Lillian only laughed. Not at all, Nicholas, she said. It was at work, so Lillian addressed her boss as you. I don't have time for this, she continued. Right now I'm all focused on work and school. Nicholas could hardly contain a sigh of relief. Besides, Lillian added suddenly, I don't want to meet anyone. I already have all the people in my life that I want to socialize with. She blushed. Nicholas suddenly felt his heart hammering hard. Did I understand you? He said, hiding a smile. He decided that it would only be a short time before he would ask her to go out with him. Then he suddenly noticed that Lillian was pregnant. Lillian tried to hide her growing belly as much as she could. She was thin, so it wasn't easy. She decided to expand her work uniform as much as possible. Then she started to wear a white robe on top, but she began to think that the clinic staff suspected something. Especially the girls noticed such things. No one asked her directly. But Lillian realized that the day would come when even Nicholas would guess her situation. And she had no idea what she would say to him. Why are you so sad today? Henry asked her as he picked her up after work to take her to the doctor. It's just been a rough day, Lillian said. Henry thought for a moment. Do you mind if I give you a friendly hug? He asked. Can I do that? Yes, Lillian said. He walked over to her, then hugged her gently. Lillian sighed and hugged him back. Thank you, she said. It really did feel better. Henry smiled. I'm very glad. Now I'll help you into the car and we'll go. We can't be late. They drove off. Lillian didn't know that Nicholas had seen the scene from the study window. Except that, without knowing the context, he took it very differently. Lillian, we need to talk, he said the next day. The girl looked up at him in surprise, and she noticed that all day long the chief was not himself. But she decided that if he wanted to, he would tell her everything himself. I'm listening, Lillian replied. Nicholas walked around the office. Have you noticed that I like you? He suddenly asked. Lillian blushed. But I had that assumption, she admitted honestly. The doctor grinned. The assumption was kind of obvious. And I didn't think you were disgusted with me either. She was embarrassed. You're a wonderful boss, she said quietly, and a great friend. I'm really glad I met you. You are. And when I asked you if you were seeing someone else, you said you weren't. That's true, Lillian replied. The warden nodded. Then how can you explain your pregnancy? I didn't want to believe it until the last minute. The whole clinic has been talking about it for 2 weeks. Lillian froze. She wanted to tell the truth. But she couldn't. She couldn't let down the couple who had entrusted her with their secret. "I don't want to talk about it," she said in a trembling voice. "That's it," said Nicholas. "Good. It's clear to me." He left the office, slamming the door. Lillian cried. The next morning, Lillian went not to the office, but to her boss. There she wrote an application for maternity leave, and after that she went to the train station to buy a ticket for the bus to the village. She was lucky because there she met a fellow villager who was also going home. When Melissa saw her pregnant granddaughter, it was as if she wasn't even surprised. Lillian was afraid her grandmother would yell at her, bringing to mind her mother, who had gotten Lillian pregnant when she was also very young. But grandmother only asked one thing. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" "Sorry, Grandma," Lillian sighed. "I can't yet." "Good, know that I'm always on your side. You can stay here as long as you want." "Thank you, Grandma. I promise after this baby comes out, I'll be able to tell you everything." "Okay, sweetheart, I hope you realize you're going to have a hard time in the village. They don't like us enough, and now you're the only one they're going to talk about." "I'm prepared for that. Did you teach me to be strong?" Grandma smiled. "You've always been strong, my girl." "Daughter, sweetheart, why did you scare us so much?" Tara exclaimed the next time they were on the phone. "What's wrong?" Tara asked. "I'm fine," Lillian replied. "I just had to leave work earlier than I had planned. I'm going to live in the village with my grandmother until the birth. Don't worry, I feel fine. I'm taking my vitamins. If it's an emergency, they'll take me straight to the hospital. It's only an hour by car." "Shouldn't you move into our house?" "Maybe?" Tara asked. Lillian smiled. "You said yourself that you have to keep everything secret, and it would be suspicious if an unknown pregnant girl lived with you for a few months and then disappeared, and you had a child." Tara sighed. "Yes, you're right. Then we can get you whatever apartment you want in the city." "No," Lillian said firmly. "I'll stay in the village with my grandmother. I feel fine. It's only an hour's drive from the city. I'll get all the tests I need. But a week before the birth, Henry will come and take you to the clinic. I won't take no for an answer." Lillian smiled again. "That's fine with me. And if you need anything, call him and me any time of the day or night." "Okay," Tara replied. "We'll be in touch anyway. I'll be waiting for your calls with a status report." "That's a wonderful idea, sunshine." Despite the fact that Lillian was telling her grandmother as if she didn't care at all, the girl was having a hard time. Most of her fellow villagers were whispering behind her back. Quietly or loudly, they were discussing her. And besides them, there were those who almost openly threw it in Lillian's face. For example, her former classmate. "What's up, Zivanareva?" "What's up, Zivanareva?" Samantha said. "I walked around the whole school with my head held high and pretended that we were all lowlifes, and you were blue bloods." Samantha had hated Lillian all 11 years, but she had only been afraid of the formidable Melissa and dared not bully her classmate. And now Samantha herself had already given birth to Aunt Carolyn's son, who had once been in love with Lillian by the alcoholic Ryan. Samantha thought she had a chance to get even with her rival. "I don't think so," Lillian said calmly. "You've been out on the town with no one to blame." "Who's the father?" continued her classmate. "You don't know." Lillian didn't answer. Of course she pretended it didn't hurt her. But in fact it was so painful to listen to all the dirty gossip and whispering. It's only a little longer, she told herself every day. She was also very upset that Nicholas had never called her. She berated herself so much for not talking to him. She should have broken the pact and told him everything or left before her belly became visible. And she should have confessed her feelings, told him she understood, that she'd noticed how much he liked her and that she liked him just as much. Except now it was too late. She'd betrayed his trust. Nicholas won't forgive that. "Okay," Lillian said to herself, "I have to think about Grandma, and also about school, and also about the promise I made to Tara and Christopher." The delivery date was getting closer. My stomach was getting heavier and lower, and my legs were already swelling badly. By the end of the day, my back was aching and I had to pee constantly. Henry's coming to pick you up the day after tomorrow morning, Abigail said during another of her almost daily calls. I'll remember, the girl replied. I've already packed a bag. Good for you. And let's dress warmly. The weather forecast promises a blizzard in the coming days. Good, Tara. How are you feeling? I'm fine, by the way. Lillian lied. I can't believe it's so soon. I feel lighter than I did in the middle of my pregnancy. Let's hope it goes that way. It will be our best New Year's present ever. Lillian smiled. Yes, if everything goes well, you will already be welcoming the new year with your daughter. She heard Tara sigh. Oh, we're so excited, you can't imagine, Tara said. We've already got everything ready in the nursery. Yeah. Lillian spent the next 40 minutes stroking her belly as she listened to Tara and Christopher talk excitedly about setting up the room for their future daughter. Okay, honey, I'm rambling. Suddenly exclaimed the woman. You should get some rest. Have a good day and you have a good day. Lillian replied and passed out. She came out of her room and saw Melissa dressing as if she was going out. Lillian shivered at the icy draft and looked out the window. There she could already see the wind beginning to ruffle the branches of the trees. Grandmother, where are you going? Lillian asked. Melissa nodded and began to tighten her coat. Yes, a neighboring farm has asked to see a breeding stallion. And you're going out in this weather? Grandma waved her hand away. They'll take me there by car. Besides, they're supposed to have some fancy doctor from the city. That's great. In that case, why do you have to go? Or are you having a concilium? They can't reach him. They can't get him on the phone. Maybe he can't even make it because of the snowstorm. Then it will be necessary to at least examine the animal and give him a couple of supportive treatments so that the stallion will last until the morning. Grandmother said firmly. Lillian, you're not going anywhere in this weather. I am. Melissa snorted. Yeah, you're about to give birth. Lillian resolutely started to get dressed. It won't be soon. I feel fine. Lillian, Grandma. Who said it was quick and easy? You're such a stubborn girl, just like you. Melissa laughed. Okay, but be careful. Don't worry, Grandma. The blizzard was getting worse. Are we going to be okay? Lillian asked the son of the owner of the company who was driving her. Yes, we still have about 20 minutes to go, he replied. You'll forgive us for disturbing you in this weather, but the stallion is our everything. My father invested so much money in him, we had to take out a loan. If he dies, we'll go bankrupt. And our company employs so many people in the surrounding villages. Grandma Melissa told me. Since you built the farm, many of my neighbors have jobs. It was always my father's dream, he said simply. He put everything he had into this farm. Lillian nodded. I promise I'll do everything I can for your stallion. After the examination, it was clear that the stallion would live. Lillian told the owners, who breathed a sigh of relief. I know you have a city specialist, an experienced veterinarian, coming to see you, she said. We don't know yet, sighed the farm owner. We can't reach him because of the snowstorm. Okay, Lillian said. I'm going to give him a couple of shots and record the treatment. If your doctor doesn't come, follow it. When she had finished with the stallion and was about to ask for a ride home, the farm owner said, Oh, just arrived. The doctor can have a word. I don't remember what you said or what shots you gave. No problem, Lillian said. She waited for the town doctor to get out of the car and come to the stables. Where's our breeding patient? She heard a familiar voice. Lillian's heart raced. What was this stupid game of fate? Lillian. Nicholas seemed as surprised as she was. What are you doing here? He asked coldly. I was examining the stallion, Lillian replied. I forgot you lived nearby, Nicholas sighed. Is that the local doctor they told me about? All right, you'll tell me all about him, he said. It will be quicker that way. I don't want to be outside too long, it's already blizzarding. Nicholas hated to admit it to himself, but he was glad to see Lillian suddenly. How he'd missed her. Yes, he was angry that she hadn't told him about her relationship and pregnancy, but how much he missed her. And now he looked at her so familiar face, eyes, lips, and couldn't tear himself away. He wanted to spend just a few minutes with her, to hear her voice, to look into her big blue eyes. What he asked, because he'd been thinking and hadn't heard what Lillian had said. I said, "Did you examine the stallion too?" Lillian repeated to her husband. Nicholas blinked confusedly. Of course. I trust you completely, though he added, when it comes to work, of course. Lillian flared up but didn't answer. After examining and telling Lillian, Nicholas said, "I absolutely agree with your diagnosis and the treatment prescribed. You will make a fine veterinarian." Lillian lowered her eyes. "Thank you." Nicholas suddenly thought how much he didn't feel like going home right now. "How's the baby?" he asked, nodding at Lillian's belly. "It's fine," Lillian replied. "The tentative delivery date is a little over a week away." Already. "Yeah, you live here with your grandmother," Nicholas finished quickly for her. "We live with her," Lillian nodded. Nicholas nodded. Would you like a ride home?" he asked. "I don't want Brandon to have to drive back in this weather. I'm on my way anyway." "You'll have to make a detour," Lillian said. "It's no problem for me. If Melissa doesn't mind, I'll have a cup of tea at your place." Lillian smiled. "Thank you, Nicholas. That's a good idea." As they drove, Nicholas was filled with questions. Why had she come to the village? Where was the child's father? Who was he? He was so thoughtful that he didn't even immediately notice the change in Lillian's expression. "What happened?" he asked. "My stomach hurts," she said. "It's very tight." "Well said, Nicholas. How long has it been?" "It started when I was examining Charlotte. I didn't notice it at first. It's been happening a lot lately, but it usually goes away in a few minutes. Now it's just getting worse." Nicholas gripped the steering wheel with his fingers. "We have to go to the hospital," he said firmly. "How far to the nearest one?" "About an hour," Lillian said. "But you don't have to do that." He waved her off. "Come on. It's a blizzard. There's no telling how long the ambulance will take to get to your village. I'll drive you myself." "Thank you, Nicholas," Lillian said. He shrugged. "It's not hard for me to do that for you." Of course, he had to pretend that everything was under control, that he wasn't afraid. But in truth, Nicholas had never been so afraid. The wind was picking up, visibility was only a few meters. He wanted to go faster, but he was afraid. "How do you feel?" he asked cheerfully. "Normal," Lillian replied weakly. But with his side vision, he could see drops of sweat on her temples. He could hear her breathing hard, feel her teeth clenching in pain. "We'll be there soon," Nicholas said cheerfully, gripping the steering wheel harder. Suddenly the car hummed strangely, and then there was a sound like a gunshot. The car jumped and began to slow down. Nicholas barely had time to turn the steering wheel before they were swept off the road. "Damn it," he shouted. "What happened?" Lillian asked weakly. "Don't worry, I'll find out," Nicholas said cheerfully. In fact, he was lying. Nicholas didn't know anything about cars. He went out rather to cool down, to breathe fresh frosty air and to understand what could be done. Opened the hood. If there was something wrong, Nicholas didn't realize it. "Shit," he swore again as he closed the hood. "The cable. It's cold. Gotta get back in the car. Gotta calm Lillian down. Gotta figure out what to do about this situation." "Well, how's it going without me?" he asked cheerfully as he came back in and closed the door tightly. "Normal," Lillian replied. "What's wrong with the car?" "I don't know," honestly said Nicholas. "But that's okay. I'll take care of it." He saw the look in her eyes, so helpless, so frightened and hopeful. "I'll figure it out," Nicholas said firmly. "Don't worry." He unfolded the back seat and helped Lillian into it. "Get comfortable," he said. "Are you going to deliver the baby in the car?" she asked fearfully. "I hope I don't have to," Nicholas said honestly. "But if anything, I can do it. I'm a doctor." Lillian smiled weakly. "Veterinarian doctor," she corrected. "People are animals too," Nicholas parried. Lillian laughed, but immediately cried out in pain. "I'll try to call," Nicholas said. There was no connection in the car. He jumped outside, where the wind was literally knocking him off his feet. 10 minutes later, when his fingers were freezing, he finally got a connection. The ambulance promised to come as fast as it could, weather permitting. "Nothing. We'll hold out. You just get us out of here," Nicholas said. He was told that everything possible would be done. "How's that?" he asked Lillian when he got back. It was getting noticeably cooler in the car. Nicholas took off his jacket and threw it over Lillian. "I'm hanging in there," the girl replied. "Except that the pains have become more intense. I think it's real." "And what?" "They're on their way to pick us up," Nicholas replied. Lillian nodded, then pressed her white lips together and suddenly asked, "Don't leave me, please. I'm so scared." "I won't, I promise." The minutes, or maybe hours, of the ambulance ride seemed like an eternity to Nicholas. When he could see the flashing lights through the blizzard, he felt a great sense of relief. All the way to the hospital, Lillian didn't let go of his hand. "It's going to be all right," he repeated and put a smile on his face. "You're a good girl. We got through it all." He was even allowed to be present during the birth. Of course, the doctors thought he was the father. He didn't explain anything. He didn't have time for that. After everything was over, Nicholas went out into the hallway. He was shaking with fatigue. Lillian had just fallen asleep. Her daughter was being carried in for a checkup. Melissa was already standing in the hallway. "How's my granddaughter?" she asked. Nicholas nodded. "She's fine. So is your great-granddaughter." Melissa raised her eyebrows. "Great-granddaughter? She didn't tell you anything?" Just 2 days before, Lillian had broken the terms of her contract and told her grandmother everything. She decided it would be too cruel if she went to the maternity ward and came back without the baby. Melissa took the news, like everyone else, calmly. "You're doing a good thing for good people," she replied. "Of course, I would have taken your baby and raised it the way I raised you," Melissa said. "But it's a good thing you didn't. You're very young. You have to study and work." The grandmother was sure that her granddaughter had told the young doctor everything. She realized that Nicholas was not just a boss and mentor for Lillian. But if her granddaughter decided not to tell him about her secret, who was she to interfere? Lillian will tell her when she's ready. "Thank you for doing all this for her," Melissa said. "I was just in the right place at the right time." "Anyone would have done that," Nicholas replied. "But you were the one who was there for her." "I'm going downstairs for coffee." When Nicholas came down the stairs, he saw a familiar man in the hall. He was asking the receptionist about something. It took the doctor a few minutes to remember where he'd seen him. Sure enough, this was the guy who had picked Lillian up from the clinic that evening. She was still leaving with him. "Well, now that the kid's father is here, I'm definitely not needed anymore," Nicholas thought grimly. "I don't know what she had with him, but it's certainly none of my business anymore." He walked out of the hospital. When Lillian came to, the first person she saw was her grandmother. She was sitting beside her bed, holding her granddaughter's hand. Then Lillian saw Henry, Christopher, and Thera. The last one was holding a small package. "How are you feeling?" Melissa asked softly. "Normal," Lillian replied. "How's the baby? Is she okay?" Tara looked up at her, her eyes full of gratitude and tears. "We've decided to name her Hillary," Christopher said. Lillian smiled. "It's a very pretty name." "Thank you," Tara said. Lillian suddenly realized that she couldn't see Nicholas. "If it weren't for Nicholas, Hillary and I wouldn't be here," she said. Where is he, by the way? Melissa sighed. I saw him. I think Nicholas left. You didn't tell him anything? No, Lillian replied. I figured you'd tell him yourself, or even pressed your lips together, Melissa said. We'll be here with you until the day after tomorrow, Tara said. And then we'll take you home and help you pack your things. Things? Lillian asked in surprise. Tara raised her eyebrows. Sweetie, you don't seem to have fully come to your senses yet, she sighed. Remember the terms of the contract. You gave birth. We bought you and Melissa a house in the Phoenix City limits. I remember, Lillian replied. I just didn't think it would happen so fast. What's the holdup? Christopher said. Henry had the house ready. It should be ready to live in for Christmas. It's all decorated. He'd put up the tree, put up the lights, even bought the food for the holiday table. Henry Lillian smiled. You're wonderful. The boy waved his hands. I wanted to make you happy in honor of such an event. Thank you. When two large, expensive black cars drove into town, the news spread faster than the cars could reach the house where Lillian and Melissa lived. The neighbors quickly discerned that several other people had gotten out of the cars besides the occupants of the house themselves. A young guy, obviously the child's father, an older man and woman, probably his parents, and a big man in black, either a security guard or a driver. So what's so important? Our Lillian got knocked up, the neighbors chattered. A deputy, I think. Or an oligarch. Probably an oil and gas trader, others speculated. Oh, Lillian's a lucky girl. I can see why she's having babies with our guys. They're carrying their stuff around? There wasn't much stuff. Besides clothes and shoes, Lillian had packed all her books and her grandmother's veterinary books. Give it up. It's all old stuff, Melissa said. It's been 100 years since the information has been out of date. Her granddaughter shook her head stubbornly. You taught me from them? It's a memory. Grandma sighed. As always, you can't be argued with. Melissa herself, in addition to her personal belongings, took some of the dishes and framed photographs that had hung on the walls for years. If you say you have everything you need to live, she said, referring to the old beds, armchairs, table and chairs, I'll leave this junk here. If you want, Christopher put in, we can find movers, rent a car, and they can move every last nail. Melissa waved her hand. Don't give me that. She's sick of it. I haven't lived here as much as I've been hiding from myself for 20 years. Christopher nodded thoughtfully. I understand. And it's good that you decided to get out. I know how to see strong people. Both you and your granddaughter are strong. That's why you shouldn't sit here alone. And Lillian has no business being here. That's for sure. She's going to make a great doctor. The new house in Miami was even nicer than Lillian had imagined. It was in a new part of town. It was about 20 minutes from the center of the city. It was just as new and beautiful. How much is it worth? Lillian thought with quiet horror. But she didn't share her thoughts with her grandmother. The house had 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, a bath, a toilet, and 2 offices. We thought you both liked to work, Tara said. And you need your own space. Yeah, I'm a hard worker, Melissa smiled. You're going to write your memoirs, her granddaughter said. It's about time. Henry had done his best. Even the yard was festooned with garlands, colored lights winking and hanging in long, thin ribbons along the terrace. How much did all this cost? Lillian gasped. You haven't seen the inside yet, Henry smiled slyly. As soon as Lillian and Melissa stepped through the door, they both felt as if they had returned to their real home after a long absence. Everything is just as it should be, Lillian said. A blazing fireplace, soft armchairs, the lights dimmed a little. There was a tall Christmas tree in the living room, which made Lillian feel childishly excited. It's so nice, she said. It's wonderful here, Melissa said. I'm glad you like it, Henry said simply. Tara came over. She was trying to keep her voice down because little Hillary had just fallen asleep in her arms. The men will bring your things in, and we'll leave you to it," she said. "Come and rest." "Thank you, Tara, and thank you," Christopher, Lillian said warmly. "Thank you, daughter," Christopher said. "And we invite you to celebrate the new year with us," Tara said. Lillian and her grandmother looked at each other. "We accept the invitation," Melissa replied. The New Year's Eve celebration left Lillian with ambivalent feelings. She stood at the window, watching the fireworks, and couldn't believe that her life had changed so drastically in just 1 year. Of course, she didn't regret her decision. There was nothing more beautiful than watching a happy Tara and Christopher standing over the crib with little Hillary. And Lillian was even somewhat proud that she was the one who could give them that happiness. And she and her grandmother now live in a beautifully landscaped house. And Lillian knows that Melissa will no longer have to live alone, carrying firewood, fetching water from the well, heating the stove. Now Lillian can be near her beloved grandmother every day. They are together again. They are again a support for each other. Only she'll never see Nicholas again. Of course, the New Year's holidays will pass, and she can return to her studies. But it's unlikely she'll dare to go back to her old job, which means she won't see him again. She wouldn't hear him laughing when Lillian told her about an incident from her village practice, and she wouldn't see Nicholas carefully and professionally examining another cat or dog. She suddenly remembers how he drove her to the hospital through a snowstorm, how he calmed her down and tried to joke when the car broke down, how he held her hand in the ambulance, and then during labor. If she had only known then, as she fell asleep, that she was seeing him for the last time, she would never have fallen asleep. "What are you crying about, sweetheart?" Lillian did not even notice how Tara silently approached her. The woman hugged her affectionately with her small white hand. "It's all right," Lillian said. "Just remembering a good man I'll never see again." She wiped her tears with the sleeve of her dress. Tara frowned. "He's alive, isn't he? So you can still see him?" Lillian shook her head. "I'm very guilty before him, and I know he'll never forgive me or want to see me." Tara put her arms around the girl and pulled her close to her. Her pensive gaze was fixed somewhere in the distance, but she asked Lillian nothing more. "3," Melissa asked confidently. She looked at her granddaughter sternly. Lillian sighed. "Yes, Grandma, I won't be able to work there. I'll pick up my paperwork today. I know the clinic your student runs is the best in the city, but there are a lot of other good ones. I'm sure they'll take me somewhere else." "Of course," Melissa replied. "But you know that's not what I mean. You need to talk to your Nicholas." Lillian blushed. "He's not mine." She cut her off and ran to her grandmother's house. She kissed Melissa and ran out the door. Stubborn Grandma sighed but smiled. Lillian really didn't want to go into the office where she had worked under Nicholas for so many months, but there were some of her personal belongings left there that needed to be picked up. She arrived early, before the workday started, hoping to get everything in before the doctor and his new assistant came in to start the appointment. The plan had almost succeeded. Lillian had already put away everything she wanted when the door opened and a familiar male voice sounded. "Lillian." She turned around, blushing. "Hello. Sorry, I wanted to get some of my stuff. I didn't realize you'd be here so early." Nicholas frowned. "Where are you going?" "Where are you going?" Lillian took a deep breath. "I'm quitting." "Why?" She averted her eyes, unable to bear the direct, piercing stare of his brown eyes. "I don't think we should work together," Lillian said. Nicholas raised an eyebrow mockingly. "Why have I offended you in any way? I remember the last time we met, you didn't want to let go of my hand and asked me not to leave. What's changed?" Lillian got angry. "You know very well what has changed. And you've made it very clear to me. Besides, if it weren't for the circumstances, it's unlikely you'd be willingly holding my hand." She shook the bag of belongings decisively and took a few steps towards the exit. "It's been a pleasure working with you," Lillian said quickly and abruptly, as if afraid to change her mind. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go." Nicholas smiled. He stood up, blocking the way. Then suddenly he took her hand gently, looked into her eyes and said, "I know everything." Lillian thought she had misheard. "Know what? All about surrogacy? But how?" He smiled. "I got a call from an old client yesterday. I thought something had happened to her cat again. But the cat's fine." Lillian gasped. "So Tara told you everything herself?" Nicholas nodded. "She said she saw you crying on New Year's Eve and began to guess something. And then, with your grandmother's help, she confirmed her guesses. I hope they're both right. And the reason you're crying is really because of me." Lillian laughed. Whatever the situation, Nicholas always knew how to make her laugh. "Are they wrong?" he asked worriedly. "What about the mystery?" Lillian asked, ignoring his question. "They didn't want anyone to know about it, did they?" Tara said that she and her husband were so happy that they didn't care now, even if the whole world finds out that it was you who carried their child. Lillian smiled. "You didn't answer the question," Nicholas added. "Surely you can guess that I like you?" Lillian replied. "And after you didn't run away from my labor and fainted, I decided to run away right after it." Lillian laughed. "So now it's okay for me not to quit?" she asked. Nicholas nodded. "What's more, I hope that you will work with me in this clinic for many more years, first as an assistant and then as a colleague." "I hope so too," Lillian said. "But haven't you found a new assistant?" The doctor shook his head negatively. "I was waiting for you to come back." "That was stupid," Lillian sighed. "And it would have been nice," Nicholas continued, ignoring her remark, "if you'd started seeing me. Unless, of course, you're really in love with that guy who picked you up after work." Lillian laughed. "Now I see what upset you back then." "No, I'm not in love with Henry." She rose on tiptoe and kissed Nicholas on the lips. He gently wrapped his arms around her, pulled her close, and kissed her back.